CD7.
Several hours later, Zoe was in a club called Market, slightly unsteady on her feet after necking too many happy hour bargain drinks. To her relief, the evening had been really fun so far. First, they'd had dinner in a Mexican restaurant, where everyone had swapped funny stories, even her, and caught up on the gossip. And then since arriving at the club, they'd been dancing like they were 18 again, making up daft routines and prattling about. Dare she say it? She actually felt wonderfully normal again, as if she'd been allowed out of her misery prison for a brief, carefree holiday. It was so good to lose herself in the music and dance. Now she was at the bar, still absent-mindedly swaying to the beat while she waited to be served. "You got very sexy legs, darling," she heard, and turned to see that a man wearing a horrible fake leather jacket had appeared beside her. "Pardon?" she said. He had a sweaty face and his eyes kept flicking from side to side as if he was on something. Mid-40s, scrawny, weaselly-looking, she thought. "Sexy legs, you." He jabbed a finger at her. "You've got sexy legs." Zoe stepped back because spit was flying in her face. "Oh, right. Thank you," she said automatically. Then she turned towards the bar, willing the barman to look at her and take her order fast. Also wishing that she hadn't just said thank you to the weasel, like it made any difference what he thought, like she was grateful. "Very sexy. Wouldn't mind having those legs wrapped around me," he leered. She ignored him. He wasn't easy to put off, though, looming closer. "Oi, I'm talking to you. I said I wouldn't mind having those sexy..." "I heard what you said." She put her elbow down on the sticky bar, trying to establish a barrier between his space and hers, wishing he'd go away. Her fleeting joyfulness was in danger of evaporating. "But I'm not interested." He leaned against her shoulder. She could smell his gross sweet aftershave mingled with the stink of beer. "You're not interested," he repeated. She wasn't looking directly at him, but felt his mood change in the next instant. An angry exhalation followed by, "Well, fuck you then. No need to get up yourself, darling. I only said you had nice legs. Jesus Christ, tight bitch." Once upon a time, she might have been cowed by his nastiness. But life had been so dire recently that she no longer felt anything could touch her. "You think that will upset me? Think again, mate." "I don't give a shit what you think about my legs. It's not your place to comment on them," she retaliated, but he wasn't listening. "I gave you a compliment, and that's all you can say? Not interested?" He was shouting now, full blast, spit raining everywhere. "When you're dressed like that, prick tease, that's what you are. All I'm trying to do is give you a compliment. Why do you have to be such a bitch?" God, she hated it, when men thought you owed them the goddamn world just because they had made some pervy comment about your body that you hadn't even asked for in the first place. "I don't want your compliments. Don't you get it?" she yelled back, suddenly furious. Out came all the anger she'd been squashing down since Patrick's death. Torrent of hot rage. How dare he? "I'm not a bitch. I'm not a prick tease. I'm having a night out with my friends. What part of that do you not understand? 4 mojitos and a gin and tonic, please," she added frantically, seeing the barman glance her way. "Fucking bitch," said the man. But at least he staggered away from the bar and left her in peace, no doubt intending to latch straight on to some other woman in the hope of a better reception. Ugh, good riddance. She felt her strength falter with the relief of his disappearance. Her hands trembled as her anger subsided, and she had to grip the bar, tears prickling her eyes. "It's okay. You're okay," she told herself. "Don't get upset about a waste of space like him." All the same, his whiplash flip to aggression had been horrible. She wanted to go home all of a sudden. Her skin was too thin for confrontation, and she felt bruised from the encounter. Plus her feet were killing her, and the music was too loud. She wished she could transport herself to the safety of her sofa this minute, with the comfort of having her baby sleeping soundly mere meters away. 4 mojitos and what was it, a vodka tonic? The barman bellowed just then. Gin and tonic, please, she replied, dabbing a tissue to her eyes and hoping her mascara hadn't smeared. It was 1:30 in the morning, the latest she had deliberately been up for weeks, and she felt shattered. Gloom enveloped her as she replayed the unpleasant encounter in her head. Was this how it was going to be from now on, as a single woman, dealing with disgusting idiots, with nobody waiting for her at home? She wondered if she would ever be held by a man again, ever feel that mutual spark of attraction, and decided probably not. She was destined to be loveless and alone from now on. Hey, you okay? Claire goosed her from behind and Zoe jumped. Having a good night? Oh, I love this tune, she cried before Zoe could answer. Me too, said Zoe, trying to sniffle back her sadness and pay the barman at the same time. Deep breath. Forget the weasel. You were having fun before, remember? It's really good to see you out and about, babe, Claire yelled. Her cropped fair hair was pulsing red and purple in the flashing lights. Her lipstick had smudged. Oh, is that for me? Thanks. You all right? Yeah, said Zoe, doing her best to smile. Nobody liked a wet blanket on a night out, she reminded herself. I'll help you carry the drinks, Claire said, grabbing a couple of the glasses. Then let's get back on the dance floor. Zoe gulped in a breath. Happy thoughts, happy thoughts. Right behind you, she said. Chapter 21. If Dan thought he was in for an easy ride babysitting at Zoe's, he quickly realised he had been kidding himself. He struggled to get Gabe to bed at the required time, initially because his nephew was being funny and charming, and Dan didn't want to be that strict, overbearing uncle who said no. This backfired spectacularly, however, when the boy nosedived into overtired stroppiness, yelling that Dan couldn't tell him what to do, and that Dan couldn't make him go to bed. The finale was a thermonuclear meltdown of shouts and angry tears from Gabe, although Dan was admittedly starting to feel the same way, and Gabe furiously refusing to say goodnight to his uncle and shutting the bedroom door in his face. Okay, so that was a lesson learned, Dan thought ruefully, heading back downstairs. As for Ethan, Dan was surprised to find that his older nephew seemed somewhat detached and unfriendly. Having felt as if the two of them had bonded during their sculpture trail, particularly when Ethan came out to him, Dan wasn't prepared for the boy to be quite so monosyllabic this time, all shrugs and gaze avoiding, despite his best attempts. Hoping to engage, Dan suggested that the two of them go to a classical music concert sometime. You could educate me. And when that received a subdued response, he mentioned that there was a good zombie film on tonight and maybe they could watch it together. Nah, Ethan said offhand. He was staring at the screen of his laptop, playing a shoot-'em-up game, and glanced around in a "are you still here" sort of way a moment later. Dan took his cue and left. Well, he tried, he told himself, trudging downstairs again in defeat. Feeling useless, he opened up Facebook on his phone and was unable to stop himself from seeking out Rebecca. Since his mum had told him the news about her, bitterness had taken root inside him. How dare she happily get on with her life after what she'd done? It was like someone walking away from a car crash without a backward look. I don't care about you. Oh Christ, there it was. A photo of a black and white ultrasound scan, along with Rebecca's caption, "Thrilled to announce that Rory and I are going to be parents. Due Halloween. Can you believe? No rude comments." Bile rose sourly in his throat. Talk about smug. thrilled to announce, as if she were a member of the royal family or something. How was it that Rebecca could have behaved so deceitfully, betrayed him so terribly, and yet good things still happened to her? You could argue, as he had done in his own head many times, that if it hadn't been for Rebecca's treachery, Patrick would still be alive today. Life would have carried on as normal, and Dan would currently be discovering the Bolivian salt flats with Tiggy, sporting the best tan of his life, instead of attempting to be the human sponge for his brother's family and soak up all their grief. "Screw you," he said under his breath. He felt mad with hatred suddenly, consumed by it. He couldn't remain silent. He was too resentful, too worked up. He skipped back to the message of condolence she'd sent him. Devastated to hear the news about Patrick. And before he could stop himself, typed a reply, fingers shaking. "You've got a fucking nerve, Bex. He told me, you know, about the two of you. Your shitty little secret. So don't you dare give me your fake sympathy and crocodile tears. I couldn't care less what you think." And then, just for the hell of it, and because he was too full of rage to pause long enough to think twice, pressed send. Fuck it. He'd had enough of turning the other cheek. He'd had enough of being blamed for what had happened to Patrick when there were other people in the equation. It wasn't all my fault, he thought, slamming his phone back down again. The next morning, after a terrible night's sleep, Dan couldn't help feeling as if the children had conspired to give him one set of challenges after another. Or maybe this was, in fact, merely a true reflection of what it meant to be a parent. First of all, Bea woke up at the crack of dawn, and as Dan peered blearily in the cupboards for cereal boxes, sighed. "Daddy always used to make pancakes when it was the weekend." Perhaps guilt over his message to Rebecca had left him vulnerable to such emotional manipulation. So far, no reply. Or perhaps it was the chance to do something Patrick-related for his niece and chalk up another good deed. Whatever it was, seconds later there was Dan Googling pancake recipes on his phone and whipping up a lumpy batter. Then, when the boys eventually shambled downstairs, Ethan looking particularly peaky as if he had been up all night, shooting gangsters on his laptop, Dan felt obliged to nourish them with rounds of scrambled egg on toast. "See, I can look after them. I can do a good job," he told himself doggedly, only for Gabe to throw a forkful of scrambled egg at his brother during an outbreak of arguing, and for tempers to combust all over again. At the sight of the eggy splatters on the window and wall, Dan's patience finally evaporated. "Boys," he cried in dismay, only for Ethan to take offence at being included in the scolding when he hadn't thrown anything. He'd gone storming off upstairs, leaving the rest of his breakfast untouched. So no, babysitting hadn't been a total success overall. Aware that Zoe was due back at any moment, Dan frantically cleaned everything up, then tried to make amends between his nephews, wanting the house to be harmonious when their mother returned. It wasn't to be, though. Both boys were white-faced and surly, no doubt as a direct result of Dan's lax bedtime enforcement the night before. They were still so angry too, he realised. Angry with the world and how it was possible that their dad could be snatched away from them without warning. The revelation was sobering, especially as Dan had been secretly priding himself on how much time he'd spent with them. He'd been kidding himself, though, if he thought that had changed anything. Taking his nephews and niece out a couple of times to fun activities wasn't anywhere near enough to make up for the loss of their dad. Didn't even register, in fact. For the first time since he had begun his sabbatical, Dan felt the weight of what he was trying to achieve and wondered if it was even possible. Still, at least he had given Zoe a night away, he reminded himself, drying the egg pan and putting it back in the cupboard. even if she did look worn and queasy as she arrived back at the house soon afterwards, her eyes narrowing at the edges, as if the weak morning light alone was triggering an automatic headache upgrade from god-awful to life-threatening. "Good night?" he asked as she headed for the espresso machine. "Mostly," she said cryptically. He decided not to hang around too long. Sometimes a hangover was best managed in private. But then, just as he was about to leave, she surprised him with the news that she was taking the kids to her mum's place in South Wales the following week. "Oh," he said, deflating a little. Was that disappointment he was feeling? "For the whole week?" "Yeah, we're heading off on Monday. I need a break, to be honest. I need my mum. Plus, my brother lives nearby too, and he and his husband have been so supportive. It'll be good to spend a bit of time with them all." "So supportive," Dan repeated in his head, unable to prevent a sting of jealousy. More supportive than him? He wanted to ask, as if it was some kind of competition. He found himself wondering if Ethan would confide in his other uncle, his gay uncle, as he had done with Dan, and felt jealous of that too. Which was fairly pathetic of him, admittedly. "Oh, right," he said. "Nice," he remembered to add. Damn it, though, this was going to bring his stats right down on the Patrick plan. "Can I do anything for you while you're away?" he asked, hovering by the door. "I could pop by and keep an eye on the place now and then if you want. Do some gardening or..." He was clutching at straws, especially as he'd offered his lawn mowing services once before and she'd given him short shrift. So he was surprised when Zoe leaned against the wall, looking thankful. "Oh, would you? The garden, I mean. Everything's gone mad suddenly and I haven't had the energy to get it under control. Thanks, Dan. Here, let me give you the spare key." She opened a drawer, pulling out a bunch of keys. "These two are for the front door," she said, dumping them in his outstretched hand. "But don't worry if you're busy. It's only if you have time." He couldn't speak for a moment, because the keys now weighing down his palm were attached to a familiar battered Fulham Football Club keyring. Patrick's old house keys, which presumably had been retrieved from his jacket pocket in the mortuary. Goosebumps prickled along Dan's arms, even though the house was warm. "Thanks," he managed to say. "No problem. Well, have a great time, and I guess I'll see you on..." He didn't know when he was going to see her again, he realised. Well, a fortnight today, I suppose." "Gabe's birthday party," she replied. Gabe's... Shit, why did he not know his own nieces' and nephews' birthdays? "Oh, didn't he give you the invitation? Sorry, I should have said earlier. He really wants you to be there," Zoe said, at which point the sun seemed to come out around Dan's head and a jubilant fanfare sounded. "And so do I. I could use an extra pair of hands if you don't mind. Let me get you the details." Dan stuffed the keys in his pocket, his spirits lifting once more as she went in search of the invitation. Gabe wanted him there at the party. Zoe wanted him there at the party. This was good. He was useful to them. Needed even. Then she returned with a small, colourful piece of paper. "A superheroes party. Cool," he said, still chuffed at this clear sign of acceptance. "Yeah," Zoe said. Maybe it was the hangover, but she had suddenly gone kind of furtive. Shifty even. Then she blurted out, "There is just one thing, actually. Gabe's asked everyone to dress up and, well, ages ago when he first started talking about wanting a superhero party, Patrick had promised to dress up too. So we were wondering, would you?" It took a moment for the penny to drop. "Would I dress up? As a superhero? What, in tights and stuff?" "Well, yeah, basically. Could you bear it? And help with the games and everything?" She bit her lip. "I know it's a lot to ask, and you might have other plans, but..." Her eyes pleaded with him. "Gabe would really like it." "Sure," Dan found himself saying, powerless to refuse her. Stepping into not only Patrick's shoes, but his fancy dress costume too. Absolutely. Also, hello, dressing up as a superhero. Did it get any more symbolic than that? Of course I will, he said. Dan hadn't seen his friends since the night in the pub that had ended in his own face-down drunkenness and vomiting. But although he tried to keep a low profile and avoid future social gatherings, the others weren't so willing to let that happen. They'd clearly discussed the situation behind his back and decided that an intervention was necessary, because they'd all been on his case this week. Steve was going on at him about joining the rowing club. You'd be doing me a favour. I need someone there who's as shit as me. While Neil kept texting him details of crappy-sounding punk bands that were playing in the area. And Mark had been steadily badgering him about going running together. So far, Dan had managed to ignore all of their requests, until on Saturday morning he arrived home from Zoe's to find Mark jogging up the road with a look on his face that said he was not about to take no for an answer. Come on, lightweight, get your trainers on. Let's do this, he said, clapping his hands like a PE teacher. Dan must still have been feeling a glow from his new superhero mission, because to both his own and Mark's surprise, he acquiesced. Having dug out some knackered old shorts and a new previously unworn t-shirt bought for his South American travels, it wasn't long before the two of them were jogging over Hammersmith Bridge together. Once Dan's initial breathlessness had eased, they chatted away about nothing and everything. Football, politics, the new car Mark had been eyeing up. Dan's lungs ached with this unusual burst of exercise, but the blood was singing through his veins as their feet pounded along in unison. Below them on the river was a bunch of kids in kayaks, their shrill, excited voices drifting up on the breeze, as well as one of the old steamboats full of tourists. Dan couldn't remember the last time he'd crossed the bridge on foot, with the luxury of being able to look down and around. All right, Mark asked, as they reached the other side and swerved onto the river path skirting the wetland centre. It was drizzling, but Dan appreciated the cool mist of water on his face and hair. Yeah, he said. Yeah, this is good. Thanks. Being out here had released the spectre of Rebecca from his head too. He'd spent most of the night swinging between agony at having sent her his combative message and defiance, telling himself it was no more than she deserved. Had she read it yet? How would she reply now that she knew he knew? Dan exhaled slowly, trying to breathe her right out. Go away, Rebecca. You've done enough damage. As if sensing that he needed distracting, Mark asked about Zoe and the kids, and Dan found that he had plenty to say. Spending more time with them recently meant they had become much more vividly coloured in for him. They had become Ethan, Gabe and Bea, real people, rather than 3 children who briefly intersected his life now and then. And guess what? I've got to dress up as a superhero for Gabe's party in a fortnight, he said at the end. Mark hooted with laughter. Christ, my eyes are burning at the thought, he replied. Are we talking lycra tights and all, or... Yep, said Dan. I just hope I don't make any of the kids cry at the sight. Or the mums swoon, Mark smirked. Dan snorted. I'm pretty sure that won't be happening, unless it's through horror alone. Dan? Dan Shepherd, came a voice just then, and Dan looked round to see that a man with a chocolate-brown Labrador was waving at him nearby. Gareth, Dan said in surprise, thudding to a halt. Gareth Chappell was a colleague of his, but their paths usually crossed amidst the sterility of the air-conditioned office floor, clad in suits and ties, rather than outside on the riverbank, with Dan wearing sweaty running gear. How are you? Oh, this is Mark, by the way. Mark, Gareth from work. All right, said Mark, consulting a fitness tracker on his watch, then continuing to jog on the spot. Hi there, said Gareth, before turning back to Dan. All good. Work's crazy as ever. You know how it is. There was a short pause and then he asked, So how was Thailand? Was it Thailand? Are you back in the office again soon? Beginning of June, Dan replied, reaching down to pet the dog, which was nudging at his leg. Its ears were like damp suede beneath his fingers. He straightened, aware that Gareth was waiting for elaboration. I'm working on some other stuff for the time being. Gareth raised an eyebrow. Moonlighting, eh? Just kidding. Well, you're not missing much. Duncan Smith got fired for fraud, so an audit team has swooped in and are poking into everything. It's like living under the Stasi. All the rumours and secrecy. Anyway, yes, all right, Mungo, he said as the dog began pulling at the lead. Better go. Good to see you. Likewise, said Dan, setting off once more. I've forgotten you weren't working, Mark said, as they jogged along again. How are you feeling about going back? Dan lengthened his stride a little. I hadn't really been thinking about it, he confessed. In the last few weeks, he had barely thought about work at all, he realised. Least of all wonder what was happening there without him. His desk appeared in his head like a vision. His desk and filing cabinet, the computer screen and phone, silently awaiting his return. The 3 suits hanging in his dark wardrobe, ties like snakes dangling from a hanger. That life all felt so far away, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. Those early morning starts, squeezing into the Circle Line train compartments, sardine cans of commuters that whizzed the bleary-eyed 9-to-5 army to identikit air-conditioned office blocks, so that they could sit at identikit desks and type into identikit keyboards, drink coffee, bitch about their colleagues, fraudulent or not, fill in forms, attend meetings, take phone calls, go home, then do it all over again for 47 weeks of the year. That had been his world, more or less. He had worked so hard that work had absorbed 90% of his energy, leaving little space for anything else of significance or value. All the money he'd earned was piled up in his account because he had no time to spend it, or anybody to spend it with. It was only now, having detached himself from the treadmill, that he realised how infrequently he had seen his parents and the rest of the family in the last few years. How rarely he interacted with anyone out of the office environment, for that matter. On the last day of work, before his sabbatical was due to begin, he had packed up his belongings, trepidatious about not being there for 3 whole months. It had been so strange, walking out of the building, aware that he wouldn't be in touch with his clients or colleagues for such a long period of time. Deep down, he couldn't shake off a lurking anxiety that, without the central pole of the office holding up his life as usual, the rest of it might collapse like a broken tent, however far he travelled. Yet, stepping into Patrick's shoes recently had made office life seem unimportant, trivial even. The past few weeks had been chaotic, sure, babysitting last night being a prime example. But he felt as if he was experiencing new riches, inhabiting a fuller, more textured existence. Not that this could continue, obviously. Once back at work, normality would swing in and he'd have to peel himself away from Zoe's and the kids' lives again. Just when the children could really do with some consistency, not to mention extra love. I don't think I want to work anymore, come to think of it, he said to Mark, as they swerved to avoid a large puddle. Yeah, you, me and every middle-aged bloke I know, said Mark, rather pessimistically. Roll on retirement, right? Dan's phone started ringing, and he managed to wrestle it from his back pocket while maintaining pace. Pain in arse, he read on the screen, and groaned before deflecting it to voicemail. Being at the beck and call of Patrick's tenants, however sweet they might be, was definitely something he wouldn't be missing when he returned to his office job. Rosemary could wait. Right now, he just needed to run. Chapter 22. By the time it was 7 o'clock on Saturday night, Dan was starving. He'd put off Rosemary for as long as possible. Was he not allowed a day to himself? But cracked late afternoon, when he finally listened to her message and heard how her voice was wavering as if she were on the verge of tears. Call him an idiot, but off he went with toolbox and gritted teeth to sort out whatever it was this time. A leaking radiator and a new damp patch on the bedroom ceiling, as it turned out, which she was convinced must be due to a slate having come loose on the roof. Having dealt with her concerns and then grudgingly accepted a coffee and a jam tart, he was on his way home now, tired after the sleepless night he'd had at Zoe's, and looking forward to being back on his own sofa, where he could enjoy doing absolutely nothing. It was dark and drizzling, the windscreen wipers of his car making scraping sounds where the rubber trim was starting to perish, and he cursed the traffic that seemed to have swallowed up the streets. Then, braking to stop in a long queue at the traffic lights, he noticed the hot pink dress on the woman standing at the bus stop. Yes, okay, and the woman's legs. And in the next moment realised that the person he was staring at was Lydia. Coming to a halt, he looked again, wondering if his imagination was playing tricks on him, but no, it was definitely her, looking cold and a bit fed up, as she stood there shivering in a navy denim jacket, clutching a small silver gift bag, but no umbrella. Thank you, fate, Dan thought, rolling down his window. He couldn't believe how cheerful he felt to see her, a splash of colour against the dismal evening. Can I give you a lift? He called. Her face crumpled with relief as she saw him. Oh, God, yes, please. That would be amazing, she said, hurrying over. I've been waiting here for 20 minutes. I don't know what's going on with the buses tonight. As she let herself into the passenger seat, Dan smelled her perfume, spicy and reminiscent of winter evenings and wood smoke. Her long brown hair was loose around her shoulders, speckled with raindrops, and she clipped in her seatbelt, then kicked off her high heels in the footwell. Thank you, she added, setting the gift bag down by her feet. What a horrible night. I know, Dan said, conscious of how close they were sitting to one another in the small, confined space. His mind went unhelpfully blank, conversational skills deserting him. Lydia was first to break the silence. Wow, it's so tidy in here, she said, gazing around. Is it a new car? No, I'm just... He felt embarrassed seeing it through her eyes. Was she taking the piss? Yes, he had a mini car vacuum and he wasn't ashamed to admit it. A tiny bit self-conscious, perhaps, because Rebecca had always teased him about his neatness, to the point where she had rolled her eyes up to heaven and muttered things under her breath towards the end of their marriage. But what was wrong with looking after your possessions properly? It's quite old, actually, he mumbled, adding, Where are you off to? As the traffic light turned green and the cars in front began to move. Lucinda's, she replied. Do you know it? The cocktail bar off Chiswick High Road? Is that okay? Were you going in that direction anyway? Yeah, sort of, he said, even though that wasn't strictly true. No problem. He glanced across at her, taking in her pink lipstick and mascara. She had done something to her eyes, which made them look bigger and browner, and he felt kind of pedestrian in comparison, sitting there in a plain checked shirt and jeans. Say something, he ordered himself, dreading another awkward silence taking hold. You look nice, he managed. Off on a date or something? Not exactly, she replied. It's a friend's 60th birthday party. Jonathan, my boss. The guy you met in the shop the other day? Right, Dan said, thinking of office parties he'd been to in the past. Stilted affairs for the most part, with everyone wondering what they had in common, other than their clients and bitching about the receptionist. Rubbish at small talk, Dan had never managed to endure the faked jollity for long. "So you've got to be on your best behaviour, have you?" he added. Lydia laughed. "No way. Jonathan won't be. He's my godfather as well as my boss, and his parties are legendary for all the debauchery. Give it 5 minutes and someone will be dancing on the bar, that kind of thing." She pulled down the passenger mirror and examined her lipstick. In fact, it took him a while to find a venue because his 2 favourite bars refused the booking after the outrageous parties he'd held there before. "Okay," said Dan. "That kind of party." His own Saturday night plans seemed disappointingly vanilla all of a sudden. "How about you? Off anywhere exciting?" Lydia asked, as if reading his mind. She snapped the mirror shut and looked over at him. "No," he said, wishing he had a different, more impressive answer. "I've just finished work," he added, feeling the need to justify himself. "My evening is going to feature a takeaway pizza, several beers, and the telly, I should think." "You wild thing, you," she teased. "Had a busy day, then? Got rid of that tree yet?" Oh, the tree. I forgot I told you about that. No, not yet. It's on my list, but..." He pulled a face. "You know how it is. Some jobs you just keep putting off, hoping they'll go away." "Yep, replacing light bulbs, taking broken stuff to the dump. Don't get me started. Or rather, somebody please, for the love of God, get me started." He laughed. Sounds familiar." "Maybe you need to make an event of it," she suggested. "The tree, I mean. Turn the whole thing into a ceremony. Use the wood for a bonfire. Toast marshmallows. That sort of jazz. I'll help, if you want," she added, warming to her own idea. "I love a bit of fire starting. Not to mention chainsaws." "Thanks," he said. "I'll bear that in mind." He didn't feel he could tell her about the babysitting saga, much as he wanted to offload on someone. It felt wrong to talk about Patrick's other children with Lydia, but their conversation flowed easily otherwise. He talked about going running with Mark and the visit to Rosemary, while she regaled him with torrid tales of her dad getting back on the dating scene, including the panicked phone call she'd received from him halfway through one such evening when the dating question went into labour. "Went into labour," Dan repeated, mind-boggling at the unexpected twist in the tale. "Blimey, there's so much to unpack in that story. I don't even know what to ask you first." "I know, thank goodness he's only got my daughter to entertain tonight," Lydia giggled. "Oh, left here, by the way," she said, peering forward through the gloom. "Then it's the next road on the right, I think. Oh, wait, slow down. This one? Oh, no, sorry, must be the next one. Yes, there it is." And there it was, Lucinda's, a brightly lit bar with the name in neon pink loopy handwriting above. Dan found a spot to park and pulled over, wishing the journey could have been longer. "Well, have a good evening," he said, feeling formal all of a sudden. "Thanks for the lift," she said, unclipping her seatbelt. Then she hesitated, as if weighing something up. "Come in for a drink, if you want," she offered after a moment. Oh. A list of reasons why not flashed instantly through his head. He was knackered and hungry. He wasn't dressed for a party. He wouldn't know anyone there. But then he looked at Lydia again, so pretty and smiling, eyes bright, and suddenly felt sick of being the cautious type of person whose default answer was always no. He thought of Tiggy's last Facebook posting, describing how she'd completed the exhilarating-sounding Death Road mountain bike trip. New motto, say yes to everything, she'd written. Why not? "Okay, yeah," he said, tentatively. "If you don't think Jonathan would mind." She blew out her lips in a small laugh. As if. His motto is almost certainly, the more the merrier. He won't mind at all. Is that a yes, then? Yes, Dan said. And then, because his voice still sounded doubtful, repeated himself with more conviction. Yes, great. Lucinda's was heaving when they went in. Black and gold feathery bunting hung in bold zigzags across the main room, and massive gold number 60 helium balloons bobbed on strings where they'd been tied to the bar. 80s pop boomed from speakers and there was a crush of guests, some glamorous and bohemian, but others thankfully in jeans and shirts like Dan. He felt slightly overwhelmed as he followed Lydia inside, dazzled even. There was such an exuberant buzz in the air that he half expected to become intoxicated simply by breathing in. "What can I get you?" asked Lydia as they made their way through to the bar. "Oh, there's Jonathan, look." "Hey, John. Happy birthday!" Dan followed her as she went over to hug him and saw Jonathan's eyes narrow a fraction as he noticed Dan in her wake. "Dan gave me a lift," Lydia explained. "Remember he came in the shop the other day? I invited him in for a drink. Hope that's all right." "Of course," said Jonathan. His voice was smooth and charming, but his gaze lingered on Dan just a fraction longer than was comfortable. "Yes, you took Lydia out to the pub, didn't you?" he said. "Never quite got to the bottom of what that was all about." "There's nothing to get to the bottom of," Lydia said quickly, shooting a look at Dan. "Can I get you a drink, John? Oh, and here's your present. Hope you like it." He softened. "Thanks, darling," he said. "Don't tell everyone, but it's a free bar for a while, so get in there quick. Have something lovely and expensive on me." He held up an empty glass. "Mine's a caipirinha, if you're insisting." "Oh, we are," said Lydia. "Come on, Dan." If he had been intimidated about joining a stranger's party at first, the feeling didn't last long. Having studied the cocktail list, Lydia opted for a Manhattan, while Dan picked something called a Lion of Soho. And these slipped down so easily that it wasn't long before they were choosing more drinks, and Dan had decided to leave his car there for the night and get a cab home. They got chatting to a drag queen friend of Jonathan called Belladonna. "Like the kebab, darling?" His filthy stories soon had them cackling helplessly. More cocktails were ordered and then a song that Lydia liked started up. "Come on!" she whooped. And before Dan could argue, she'd pulled him onto the dance floor and forced him to dance with her. When had he last danced? He couldn't even remember. And yet, despite not being a natural mover and starting off feeling wooden and somewhat self-conscious, it rapidly began to feel like the most excellent thing to do suddenly. To throw himself around with this beautiful laughing woman, her pink dress flying out as she twirled and spun. A few cocktails later, someone produced a microphone and started up a karaoke session, something Dan would normally have cringed at and hidden away from. And yet, to his astonishment, when Lydia said, "I've put our names down for a duet, by the way. Islands in the Stream or Don't Go Breaking My Heart. Which do you prefer?" He didn't even make a run for it, throwing excuses over his shoulder. He must have been already half drunk, or at least giddy on the atmosphere, because instead he found himself answering, "Kenny and Dolly, of course." And then when it was their turn, he bellowed the song out in a terrible harmony with her, which earned them a round of applause as well as more than a few winces from those in the room who actually liked music. Afterwards, there were more drinks, random jabbing at the cocktail menu by now, rather than careful consideration, followed by more dancing. And it occurred to Dan all of a sudden that he was happy, that he felt light and free for the first time in months, as if he had left all his worries and problems at the door of Lucinda's when walking in. "I'm having the best time," he bawled into Lydia's ear, as some disco track or other came to an end and they paused for breath on the dance floor. "Me too," she yelled back, cheeks flushed, mascara smudging around her eyes. "Should we have another drink?" "Hell yeah." He could live like this too, he thought dazedly, queuing for drinks. He could have colour and music and dancing in his life all the time if he chose, if he allowed such things in again. The idea was liberating, exciting, tempting. "I'm going to change my life, you know," he confessed drunkenly to Lydia as they waited in the crush. "I'm actually gonna do that." "Your wife? I didn't know you were married," she shouted back. "My life," he yelled, just as the two women on stage bawling out a karaoke version of Bohemian Rhapsody reached the end of the song. "I'm going to change my life." He'd shouted louder than he meant to, and heads turned. Then a man with cropped peroxide hair along the bar punched the air and whooped, "Yeah, baby," at him, while a woman in a jewelled cape to his right cheered, "Do it!" and everyone laughed. Dan's exuberance continued to glow around him. He felt invincible, unable to stop smiling. Right until the moment when, returning from the gents a short while later, his way was blocked by Jonathan. "Don't you muck about with her, all right?" he said, a pleasant expression on his face, but his voice and eyes bearing an unmistakable warning. Dan was jolted out of his happy mood as if he'd been tripped up. "What? It's not like that," he said, taken aback. Jonathan took a step closer, looming over Dan. He was a good 2 inches taller and as wide as a shed door. "That girl is precious to me, understand? And I don't want to come over like a heavy, but she's had a rough time. Thanks to your brother, I believe." All the wind was taken from Dan's sails. "Right, although I promised her mum, break her heart, you'll be dealing with me. Yes?" "Yes, but good." He moved past Dan towards a couple of blokes in rugby tops, switching seamlessly back into the genial host once more. "Bob, Alex! What took you so long, you fat fuckers?" he yelled. Dan, meanwhile, slipped away, feeling chastened, as if the bubble around him had been well and truly popped. Maybe it was time to go. Jonathan was no doubt only being protective of his goddaughter, but Dan felt as if he might have outstayed his welcome anyway. He found Lydia on the dance floor with a couple of older women and went over to her. "I'm going to head off," he said. "But thanks for—" "You're going?" she interrupted him. "Already? Stay and dance, Dan." "Yeah, Dan," echoed one of the other women. She was wearing a Cleopatra-style wig that had slipped slightly on her head. "Stay and dance." "I'd better—" He glanced over to see that Jonathan was looking at him and felt a prickle of irritation. "Yeah, all right, I'm going," he thought. "Nah, I should shoot off," he told Lydia. "Thanks for asking me in, though. I've had such a good night." "Yeah, me too," she said, then towed him off the dance floor to a quieter corner. "I'm glad we did this." "Same," he replied, then hesitated, no longer in such a hurry to leave. She was standing there in front of him, her hair all mussed up from dancing, her makeup sliding off her face, but radiant and dimpled and smiling. He felt like taking her in his arms and kissing her, he realised, but that was almost certainly a terrible idea. Not least because Jonathan was likely to appear behind him at any moment and haul him off by the scruff of the neck. "Lydia, he began, unsure what he wanted to say. He felt enchanted by her, dizzied. Was this how Patrick had felt, he wondered, only to instantly regret his own question in the next moment. Don't think about him. She put her arms around his middle, so close he could smell the coconutty scent of her hair. "I really like you, Dan," she said. "I'm glad we met." "Yes," he said hoarsely. He mustn't kiss her. He must not. She was drunk, and kissing would only muddy the waters, complicate things even further. Do not kiss her, he told himself desperately, even though he could feel himself leaning towards her, gazing at her mouth. 10! A shout went up just then, and they jolted apart again. 9! 8! What's going on? Dan asked, blinking as the spell broke. The music had been switched off and a crowd had gathered around Jonathan. 7! Birthday countdown, Lydia said, slipping her arms free. 6! She yelled. It's John's actual 5! Birthday tomorrow. 4, 3, 2, 1! Yelled the crowd. Happy birthday! Someone brought through a cake alight with candles, while a man with a silver cowboy hat sat down at the piano and played a thunderous version of Happy Birthday, to which everyone sang along. Dan recognised an exit cue when he saw one and squeezed Lydia's hand. Bye, he said, leaning to kiss her on the cheek. See you soon. The sky was starlit as he stepped outside and he gulped in the cold night air. He had done the right thing, leaving now before anything happened, he told himself. He had done absolutely the right thing, and the only thing possible under the circumstances. So why then, he thought, ordering a cab and wrapping his arms around himself for warmth as he waited, did going home alone feel so wrong? Chapter 23. From the sublime to the ridiculous, or rather from the sublime to the fire hazard, Dan woke up the next morning with a pounding hangover to an urgent phone call on Patrick's work mobile. The Hussains, tenants in Shepherd's Bush, had just had a scare because their washing machine had burst into flames 40 minutes earlier. The fire was out, but the kitchen was a mess. Could he help? This, needless to say, was not the relaxing start to a Sunday that Dan had hoped for, especially as he'd slept so badly. Thoughts of Lydia had tumbled through his mind all night, questions unanswered, emotions churning. That moment when they'd stood so close together, her arms slotted around him, when every part of him wanted nothing more than to kiss her. If the countdown hadn't interrupted them then, he was sure they would have kissed. And what then? Oh God, it was the what then that kept him awake. The memory of her body warm against his, the smell of her hair, her smile. Stop, he thought, hitting his forehead with the flat of his hand. Having thrown some clothes on, he knocked back 2 paracetamol with orange juice glugged straight from the carton. He absolutely could not start thinking of Lydia in any romantic terms, given who she was. His first loyalty had to be to Zoe, 100%. But he wasn't mistaken, was he? That there had been something between himself and Lydia last night. Surely she wouldn't have put her arms around him like that if she felt complete indifference towards him. Or was he simply a Patrick substitute? You look like him, she had said the first time they met. Had the 2 brothers become muddled for her, in that drunken moment? Perhaps it was just as well he had the Hussain's exploding washing machine to deal with, he thought, cycling off along the quiet streets a few minutes later, his car still stranded in Chiswick. A wrecked kitchen would distract him from his confused feelings at least. He hadn't had any dealings with this particular family yet, but as he reached the terrace street, his heart sank into his trainers when he counted along the house numbers and realised that theirs was the property with the cracked front window, the badly painted front door, and the wet streaks beneath the guttering. Inside, the place wasn't a whole lot more appealing, he discovered, as Mr. Hussain, Tamil, let him in and led him through to the blackened, smoke-stinking kitchen. It burst into flames, Tamil said, gesturing at the scorched machine. He was tall and bearded, bristling with shock and bad temper, as well you might be, had something blown up unexpectedly in your house early on a Sunday morning. I've got kids, man. The whole place could have gone up. Smoke everywhere. Jana's taken them round to her mum's because our youngest has got asthma. It's not good enough. Do you hear what I'm saying? Dan did absolutely hear what he was saying and apologised profusely, promising he'd get rid of the ruined machine and have a new one plumbed in as soon as possible. The picture grew worse every time he looked at another part of the small, squalid kitchen, with damp casting a shadow across one wall, the cupboard that was missing a door, and the ripped tatty lino that now had a huge burn mark from the fire, although someone had done their best to clean it. Bloody hell, Patrick. It was a shithole, whichever way you looked at it. And what was more, he'd been charging the Husseins a lot of money to live here. This is my brother's business. I've only recently taken it on, Dan explained. But it looks like there's a lot of other work that needs doing here too. Tamil snorted. You don't say. My little girl's got bites all the way up her arms from something or other. The bedroom at the top has mould growing behind the wardrobe where the roof leaks. Your brother doesn't want to know, though. Too busy, he always says. Last time I spoke to him was what? 6 or 7 weeks ago. I laid it on the line, but even then he didn't bother responding. I've given up asking, to be honest, but today... He spread his hands with a fierce, impotent sort of despair. Kinda the last straw. Dan felt mortified, horrified actually, that Patrick could have let things slide so badly for this family, and ashamed that he hadn't been in touch with them himself before now. I'm sorry, he said. You're right, it's not good enough. The thing is, he died, coming up for 7 weeks ago actually. That's why he's not been in touch. Sorry, Tamil mumbled, and Dan shrugged it off, trying to prioritise what needed doing. Have the roof fixed, get a dehumidifier to help with the damp in the meantime, arrange for pest control to come in and kill off whatever was biting the little girl. He found himself imagining bees' arms covered in scarlet flea bites or a bedbug rash, and felt worse than ever. It would cost a fortune, but everything needed to be done, and he was pretty sure Zoe would be okay about sanctioning the payments. No one should have to live like this. First things first, let's get the washing machine into the front yard. Then maybe you could walk me around the rest of the house so that I can start making a list. Perhaps he should have taken his brother's side, Dan thought, as the two of them shuffled the stinking, burned washing machine out from under the sink and heaved it towards the front door. Perhaps he should have defended Patrick more staunchly, come up with some excuse for why he had allowed this house to fall into such disrepair. But the words stuck in Dan's throat. What was wrong with you? He thought angrily of his brother, as Tamil gave him a tour of the miserable place. And Dan added broken banister, loose stair carpet, leaking toilet, drafty windows, ancient plumbing to the list of things that needed attention. Oh, and was that some bare wiring in the little girl's bedroom? Yes, it was. For crying out loud, this place was a death trap. Accidents waiting to happen around every corner. I'm going to sort this out, he said to Tamil, feeling sickened with each new revelation. I promise. But Tamil had heard it all before, judging by his quiet coldness. Prove it then, his eyes said, as Dan left. Once they said goodbye, Dan cycled around the corner, then stopped to lean over the handlebars and breathe deeply. What the hell, Patrick? He muttered into the quiet street. What the fuck? He had felt embarrassed by his brother's shortcomings in there. A horrible thing to say, but true. You cheap shitbag, he said. Again and again you let people down. And what for? He thought of everything Patrick had had going for him. Zoe and the children, a beautiful house, a thriving business. And what a wonderful life this had added up to. Why then had he felt the need to piss all over other people's lives? Lydia and Jemima, Tamil and his family. No doubt there were others Dan wasn't even aware of. Why hadn't Patrick cared more? Why hadn't it been enough for him? Something Tamil had said was niggling away at him, a light flashing in a dim corner of Dan's brain. Then he remembered how, when he'd gone to meet Patrick that very last night, his brother had been on the phone when Dan arrived. He'd looked stressed as he noticed Dan approach, then curled around his phone defensively. What had he said? Yes, all right, give me a break, or something. He'd seemed rattled anyway, agitated. He'd smoothed over his feelings as soon as Dan asked if he was okay, of course. But had Patrick been okay? Had it been a fed-up tenant, perhaps Tamil himself, getting heavy with him? Had Patrick felt cornered, defeated by his workload, driven to the edge? Dan put a hand to his head, not liking to think about his brother in that state. Why hadn't he tried harder to get to the bottom of whatever had been going on? Why hadn't Patrick been able to confide in him if he felt under pressure? Instead, they'd had that stupid, pointless argument where Dan had pushed him away. What if it had all been too much and Patrick had snapped? People did, didn't they? Middle-aged men especially, if they'd reached the end of their rope. He sighed, wishing there was some way he could know what had been going through his brother's head at the end, wishing he could understand. What happened? He muttered under his breath as he went to pick up his car. What happened that night? Dwelling on it was no use, so he threw himself into practical work instead, driving to the nearest Currys where he ordered a new washing machine to be delivered and plumbed in for the Hussains' next day's service, with the old machine taken away. He added a fridge-freezer to the order for good measure, remembering how their existing one had looked positively medieval in age. It was a start, he told himself, texting Tamil to give him the news, adding that if need be he could wait in for the delivery tomorrow himself. Afterwards, he felt slightly at a loss for what to do. He drove back towards his flat until an impulse sent him off the motorway at Chiswick roundabout in the direction of Kew Bridge, then heading towards the cemetery in the hope that it would bring him the comfort he needed. The cemetery was hushed and still. It had been raining earlier that morning and the trees were sodden, their new leaves dripping each time a breeze shook the branches. But the sun seemed set to break through the clouds any moment, creating a pearlescent, marbled effect in the sky. Dandelions and bluebells sprouted between the aged headstones with some cheering yellow tulips growing out of one grassed-over grave. Ahead of him, a squirrel ran nimbly along the branch of a cherry tree that frothed with candy-floss pink blossom. Dan's breath deepened amidst the calm, and his inner turmoil began to recede, his fists unclenching as he walked along. It was okay, he told himself. It was all going to be okay. However conflicted his feelings about his brother on a personal level, he could still continue with his good deeds scheduled for Zoe's sake. For the children, he decided. For Lydia and Jemima too, and for the tenants. He would do Patrick's jobs for him, only better. Anything to get through the days. Then his thoughts spooled back to the night before, and he found himself wondering what Lydia was doing today. Already it seemed like a dream, the two of them dancing and singing karaoke duets amidst the black and gold party decorations. He'd felt so free and untethered, as if nothing else mattered. He thought of the smell of her hair, how she'd smiled at him and said, "I'm glad we did this." Maybe he should take her up on her offer to help with the tree in his garden, he thought, until he remembered that he was supposed to be backing off, that the whole thing was impossible, that if anything happened between them, it would only make the situation 100 times more complicated. Lydia had already been dumped on by Patrick. Whatever else he did, Dan was not going to mess her around. End of story. He quickened his pace, heading for the Garden of Remembrance where Zoe had had a plaque installed. His parents visited the cemetery every week without fail, and he knew that Zoe had brought the kids too a number of times to pay their respects and talk to Patrick, but Dan hadn't made the journey here before. He wasn't sure why. Partly because it seemed a very public way to demonstrate your grief, announcing in effect to the rest of the world, "Here I am, being sad about my loved one who died. Witness my sorrow," When given the choice, he would always rather deal with stuff in a private space. Apart from today, apparently. The Garden of Remembrance seemed empty when he arrived, but then he noticed a woman in a pale blue coat sitting on a bench, hands in her lap. He didn't recognise her, and assumed she was the relative of someone else altogether. So he was taken aback when she peered at him, then stood up and asked, "Are you Patrick Shepherd's brother?" "Yes," he said, trying to place her in his mind. Gingery hair, late 30s, slender, anxious-looking. "Nope, not ringing any bells." "I'm sorry," he said. "My memory's terrible. Have we met?" She pulled a tissue from her coat pocket and dabbed her eyes. "I was at the funeral," she said. "My husband and I, we were friends of him and Zoe. He was such a great guy." Oh, here we go. Just what he didn't need. "Yes," he said, feeling tired. So much for the quiet reflection he'd hoped to have with his brother here. "But how are you? The grieving process is so slow, isn't it?" "You must still be in bits," said the woman, gazing at him with keen sympathy. There was something distastefully eager about her manner, he thought, stepping back and trying not to shudder. Parasitic, even. One of those people who wanted to feast on the sufferings of others, who loved hearing all the tragic details. It was surprising how many of them he'd come across in the last couple of months. He was unwilling to throw her any tidbits. "I'm keeping busy," he replied shortly. Keeping busy, trying to deal with the fallout from Patrick's life, secrets and all. Tormenting himself with thoughts of Patrick's last moments. Anyway, he wasn't going to hang around discussing his brother with this woman he didn't even know. "Should I mention to Zoe that I bumped into you, or—" It was strange, but her face stiffened at Zoe's name. Her nostrils actually flared like a spooked horse. Interesting. She faltered for a second, but then her composure returned. No, there's no need. I'll probably see her next week at school. Thanks, though." She pantomimed, looking at her watch. "Oh gosh, I lost track of the time," she said. "Better go." She stood up and brushed herself down, returning to the role of grief-stricken friend. "So sorry for your loss," she said, putting a hand lightly on Dan's arm for a moment, before walking away. Dan watched her go, her perfume drifting through the air behind her, pungent and kind of sickly. Then he sank into the nearest bench with a frown. That had been odd, he thought to himself. Something about it didn't quite ring true. It was almost as if she'd been acting a part. Tilting his head back, he stared up at the sky, still chewing over the exchange. Then he sighed as the obvious struck him. "You didn't, did you, Patrick?" he asked under his breath. "Come on, man. Seriously? Again?" He groaned, hoping he was jumping to conclusions. But as he looked over again at the red-headed woman, now just about vanishing from sight, he had a horrible sensation of déjà vu. "I don't want to know," he said aloud. "This time, I'm not getting involved. Understand?" Chapter 24. As the next week began, Dan made it his business to show Tamal and Jana Hussain that he could keep his word. He was there at the house on Monday when their new white goods were delivered, and hung around while the washing machine was plumbed in, until he was satisfied it worked properly. A couple of roofers and a handyman arrived on Tuesday in order to provide quotes for the various repairs, with Dan intending to book in one of the roofers to start as soon as possible. Also due that week was a visit from a pest control service, in the hope of finding out what was biting the Hussain's daughter. In the meantime, Dan had shelled out for a new vacuum cleaner that was advertised as being the best for children with allergies, and ordered a replacement lino for the kitchen to be fitted the following week. He'd told Tamil and Jana that he would paint the place from top to bottom as well, once all the work had been completed. It was satisfying to see progress being made, not to mention a real difference to the family's lives. It felt like paying off a debt, righting a wrong. Plus, it kept him busy, too busy to think about Lydia very much, probably a good thing, and too busy to dwell on Rebecca and what she had made of his message. There was so much to do, in fact, that it wasn't until Wednesday that he was free to drop round to Zoe's as promised. Talk about stepping into Patrick's shoes. He almost felt as if he was Patrick as he let himself into the house with his brother's own set of keys. "Hello," he called, even though he was pretty sure that Zoe had said she wouldn't be back until Easter Monday. The rooms felt oddly quiet without their usual noisy residents present. The night before, Dan had looked at his social media to see that Zoe had uploaded various photos and video clips of her and the kids with her parents and brother in Penarth, and he'd pored over them all. There were the two boys on the beach, running over shingle with their coats flapping out behind them in the wind, like superhero capes, which reminded him he must sort out his own fancy dress costume for Gabe's party. There was Bea in yellow wellies at the edge of the surf, turning round to wave at the camera, a new gap visible in her front teeth. There was a lovely shot of Zoe with her arms around two men, one who had the exact same nose as her, presumably her brother Niall, and the other with a pop star dark quiff and a stubbled jaw, whom she'd tagged as Mark, Niall's husband, Dan guessed. He'd zoomed in on a group shot of the family, checking each of their faces for tension, but they had all been smiling and laughing, relaxed and happy. Good. Dan was so relieved he didn't even feel a pinprick of jealousy this time. Gathering up the post and leaving it in a pile on the side table, he walked through the house, his fingertips trailing along the wall. If Patrick's spirit was anywhere, it would be here, rather than in the breezy memorial garden, he thought. His brother's coat still hung on the peg, and he smiled handsomely down from the wedding and family photos on display. Even his trainers were visible in the shoe basket, Dan noticed. On a whim, he slid off his own jacket and put on Patrick's coat, just to see what it was like. The insides of the sleeves were cold against his arms, but he fancied he could detect a whiff of aftershave still clinging to the fabric. It was a size too big for him, of course, too broad on the shoulders, too long around his body. As a boy, Dan had always looked forward to becoming as big and strong as his brother, but he'd never quite caught up. Outliving him didn't really count as a consolation prize, he supposed. Catching his reflection in the hall mirror, he felt shifty about wearing Patrick's coat, as if he might be caught and reprimanded for it. He took it off again and carefully hung it back up with the others, wondering how long Zoe would keep it there. Presumably, Patrick's side of the wardrobe was still stuffed with his shirts and suit jackets as well, the drawers in their chest filled with his t-shirts, jeans, socks and pants. When did you make the decision to start removing the physical stuff from your home? He wondered. It must surely help to bring about some closure and acceptance, but at the same time, the clearing of possessions was so final, a huge letting go. Perhaps the scale of the operation was what was putting Zoe off, he thought, making his way through the kitchen and out to the shed. Could he help her in this? He would test the waters with a tentative suggestion, he decided, imagining that it might be the sort of chore it was very hard to begin alone. Unlocking the garden shed, he heaved out the lawnmower, which was dusty and festooned with lacy cobwebs, then tracked down an extension lead and plugged it in. Spring had arrived in the back garden since he'd last been here. There were white tulips in the borders, and the magnolia tree was dripping with crumpled star-shaped flowers. The blue sky was torn up with vapour trails from aeroplanes above, and the air was warm and sweet-scented, like a blessing. Wednesday morning, and here he was, outside mowing a lawn with the sun on his face and the smell of grass clippings rising up around him. In just over a month, he'd be installed in his office again and probably wouldn't even notice the weather anymore, apart from when he walked to the tube station and back each day. The garden wasn't large enough for the task to take long, but Dan made a thorough job of it, cleaning and sharpening the blades afterwards, before returning the mower to the shed. Now what, he wondered, winding the extension cable around the reel. He went back inside, still half expecting to hear shouts from the children or to see Zoe drifting around like an anxious wraith. He couldn't help noticing once more how scruffy the kitchen was these days, how neglected and sad it still felt in here. The whole room could really do with a lick of paint and spring clean, just to lift everyone's spirits. Then he thought of how he had transformed the Whitecliff Road property with a few cans of emulsion and gloss and wondered, well, he could do the same for Zoe, couldn't he? He could easily spruce the place up as a nice surprise for when she came back.
This is the end of CD 7. The book continues on CD 8. CD 8.
The idea gained momentum like a car moving up through the gears. Let's face it, she hadn't even taken Patrick's coat down in the hall yet, he told himself, so painting and decorating were hardly priorities for her right now. Whereas he had a few days at his disposal, and so... He paced around, feeling feverish with all his good intentions. Should he? His eye fell on the grubby skirting boards, the scrapes and scuffs on the walls, the greasy marks that were still there from when Gabe had thrown scrambled egg at his brother back at the weekend. He imagined Zoe coming home from her trip away and gasping as she walked into a clean, bright kitchen. How happy she would be. How grateful. Another thing that she no longer had to think about, because he'd got there first and done it for her. It was a no-brainer. Of course he was going to do this. Whistling to himself, Dan grabbed his car keys, planning to head straight out for the nearest DIY store. But then his phone rang. Rebecca, it said on the screen, and he felt a lurch inside. This was almost certainly going to be an unpleasant conversation. Or not. Maybe she was ringing to grovel, full of shame. Please don't tell Rory, I beg you, he imagined her snivelling. It could happen, right? He leaned against the hall wall, took a deep breath and answered the call. Hello? Danny? What the fuck? Was her opening gambit. She sounded furious rather than grovelling. I've been trying to work out how to reply to your obnoxious message on Facebook, but today I just thought, do you know what? I need to speak to him and find out what the hell he's on about. Were you pissed? Having a nervous breakdown? I mean, what is your problem? Her voice was very loud in his ear, with a shrill quality that he recognised from the dying days of their marriage, and he had a flashback to the argument they'd had in a Notting Hill tapas restaurant, the one that had ended with her flinging down her napkin and yelling, I can't do this anymore. What's my problem? He repeated, trying to pump himself up. Not a combative person by nature, he was nonetheless secure in his place on the moral high ground this time. She's the one in the wrong here, said a voice in his head. She brought this on herself. My problem is that you went behind my back with my brother, Bex. You and all the other women by the sound of things. He told me, so if anyone's got a problem... She made a scornful sort of noise, before wading right in over the top of him. You sanctimonious prick! How dare you speak to me like that? I've never done anything with your brother. I didn't even like your brother. There, I said it. I slagged off a dead person. Sorry, but it's true. And nothing happened, okay? Because I was married to you. Call me what you like, but I was never unfaithful to you. Never. She was practically shouting by the end of this little speech, but Dan suppressed a faint twinge of doubt and stiffened his resolve. Yeah, well, she would say that, wouldn't she? That's not what Patrick told me, he said coldly. Let's hear it then, she said. What did he tell you? I do love a good story. Some classic fiction, bit of fantasy. Wait, no spoilers, let me guess. So, I made a pass at him or something. I fancied him and tried it on, am I right? Is that what he told you? She laughed, but it was harsh and unkind, not a pleasant sound. And you believed him? Well, that's lovely. Very decent of you. He said. Rebecca's fierce self-righteousness was disarming. It had taken the wind right out of his sails. Yeah, it was something like that, he mumbled. He glanced over at the nearest photo on the hall wall, of Patrick and Zoe's wedding day, their faces so tender, so loving. Then he was back to that last evening in the pub with Patrick, the rain lashing against the black window, the two of them onto their 4th or 5th pints. She wasn't exactly loyal when you two were married, was she? Patrick had said. If you know what I mean. Dan could still picture him saying the words, a smirk playing on his lips. He'd assumed that Patrick was telling the truth when he said this, because why would anyone lie about that, for one thing? But now the ground beneath him seemed to be unstable, the world dropping away. Had Patrick lied? Rebecca seemed pretty adamant that these claims were unfounded. But if none of that was true, then it meant... And you believed him, she was saying again, voice dripping with scorn. Thanks a bunch. Jesus, Dan, Then the sound became muffled, as if she had moved the phone away from her mouth. It's okay, I'm fine, he heard her say to someone else. Yes, all right, I suppose so. Then she was back on the line, clipped and frosty. My husband wants me to stop talking to you. This imbecilic argument is probably doing terrible things to my blood pressure. So... The argument was slipping away from him, turning into something else completely. A bad joke, with Dan the punchline. He felt a twist of guilt that he might just have been deeply offensive to the woman he'd once loved most. Had he really got this wrong? Why would Patrick have lied? Embattled, he felt compelled to land one last blow instead. Ah, yes, I saw you were pregnant, he sneered. An accident, was it? I'm guessing so, seeing as you'd always said that you never wanted... But she'd gone. The call disconnected, and he couldn't really blame her. The adrenaline drained out of him, and shame slid through his veins in its place. He wished he hadn't sunk to such a scummy parting shot. Jeering at her happiness was cheap. It was mean of him. He let out a long, shaky breath. Standing there alone, his head was a tumult of terrible thoughts. Pieces of a puzzle coming together to form a dreadful new picture. And now he had compounded everything by insulting his ex-wife and making that nasty remark about her pregnancy. Like an absolute wanker. He was an absolute wanker. He had got everything wrong. He rubbed his face with his hand, wishing he could rewind all those weeks, to have a second try at the night when everything unravelled. It had started back in February with a dead tree in Dan's back garden. The neighbours had complained about it after a branch fell off into their garden and broke their solar-powered fountain, and he'd promised to cut it down before his flight to Santiago in a few days' time. Yeah, no problem, Patrick said when Dan asked him for the favour. Getting the big old sycamore out of the ground was definitely going to be a two-man job. Are we still on for a beer Thursday night, by the way? I could stop over afterwards if so, and we can get the tree done first thing Friday. They were all set. Dan had hired a ladder and chainsaw ready for the next day, and they met up in the Rutland Arms, a pub down by the river. And at first everything was good that evening, normal. The pub seemed particularly cosy, with the cold wintry rain pelting against the windows outside, and the two of them chatted about Zoe and the kids, their dad's news about his knee replacement op, Dan's travel plans, the half-marathon Patrick was training for, and all the rest of it, while they sank pint after pint. Dan had been jubilant and excited, having just finished work for the sabbatical, and felt as if he already had one foot on the plane. Another drink? Yeah, why not? The rain was falling harder and neither of them felt inclined to move yet. Conversation turned to Dan's forthcoming adventure. Think of all those women you're going to pull, Patrick had teased. You'll be making up for lost time, I bet, after all these years of living like a monk. It's not that kind of a trip, Dan protested. Yeah, but come on. It's been years now since you and Beck split. You must be gagging for it by now. 3 years, it's hardly... Exactly, and how many women have you seen since then? They'd had this conversation before, and it was always galling. Always pushed Dan onto the defensive. What was it about smug, happily married people that made them feel they had the right to interfere and criticise? Splitting up from Rebecca had been the worst thing ever to hit Dan. He'd felt as if his life had fallen apart, segmenting like a peeled orange. What was he supposed to do? March straight out after signing the divorce papers and start chatting up other women, like their marriage had never happened, didn't matter to him. Look, he said, it's not about... Because she didn't waste time moping around, eh? I mean, she wasn't exactly loyal when you two were married, was she? If you know what I mean. Dan had drunk enough by then for the pub to be blurring softly at the corners, his head pleasantly fuzzy. But his brother's words cut clean through the alcohol like an ice pick. No, he thought. I don't know what you mean. What the hell do you mean? He stared at Patrick. What are you saying? He asked. It was the smirk on Patrick's face that rankled most. The cocky look he was wearing, like this was all one big laugh. Well, you know, that time she tried it on with me, he said. The time she... What? Dan thought for a moment he must have misheard. Please God, let him have misheard. He felt stunningly sober now, every particle of his body standing to attention. What did you just say? Shit. Didn't she tell you? I thought... Patrick's brain had obviously caught up with his mouth, because his bravado now gave way to bluster, his smirk buckling into awkwardness. I mean, it wasn't anything really, not like an affair. But yeah, she made a move. There was this, thing. This thing, Dan repeated, feeling sick as he imagined Rebecca making eyes at his brother, turning that creamy, freckled face of hers towards him, quirking an eyebrow with a suggestion in her gaze. She often wore her long auburn hair in a thick side plait, and Dan could picture her twirling the end of it idly round her fingers. He'd always loved Rebecca's hair. He'd loved every bit of her. I guess I'm hard to resist, right? Give him the benefit of the doubt. Perhaps he was trying to make a joke of it, lighten the mood. But for whatever reason, Patrick was now puffing his chest out like some kind of randy ape, like the stupid, dick-driven alpha male he was. Dan laughed, but there was zero mirth in the sound. You're unreal. What? You heard me. And then it was all bursting out of him, the shock and hurt and rage. You're actually bragging about having my ex-wife, the woman I loved, making a move on you. Like you think that's funny. Tell me, why did you even go there with this story tonight? To put me down? To make me feel like shit? It's always been like that with you, hasn't it? You can't help yourself. I bet it was the other way round anyway. I bet it was you flirting with her. I bet it was... Hey, whoa! Patrick had his hand in the air. Calm down, Dan. Don't get your knickers in a twist. Yeah, and there it was. Right on cue. The old, calm down. Don't be so sensitive. Any minute now, Patrick would say that it was only a bit of banter, or something equally moronic, and then Dan would probably have to punch him, Oh, fuck off. I'm going home, he said, rising unsteadily to his feet. Without looking back, he went striding towards the door, shoving his arms into his jacket. Patrick had caught up with him by the time he'd stepped outside, mouth wet where he must have drained his last half pint in a fast gulp. He'd never been one to waste good beer. Wait, what's got into you? Jesus, it was only one night. I don't want to know, Dan yelled, pushing him away. Patrick staggered. It had been a hard push, but Dan was too angry to care. One night? Which night? And what exactly had they done all night? Every time Patrick made another glib comment, the situation became worse. Nausea surged up Dan's throat as he pictured the two of them in a clinch, Rebecca's soft, wide mouth against Patrick's, their arms twining around each other's backs. He couldn't bear it. For God's sake, I don't want to hear any more. Just shut up. He was fuming, practically trembling with rage by now. Patrick had often taken Dan's toys through childhood, broken them, lost them, been careless with them. A nice shirt Dan had saved up for as a teenager, Patrick had borrowed it without asking, and left it stained and crumpled on his bedroom floor afterwards. The motorbike Dan bought, aged 20, his pride and joy, Patrick had taken it out for a spin and returned it with a dent in the exhaust and silvery scrapes along the frame. He'd always had to show who was boss, who was the older brother. But Dan had never dreamed Patrick would stoop so low as to go there with Rebecca, his wife. To be so unbothered about how Dan might feel that he could recount it as a funny story. Did he have any feelings in there? Or was he all just one enormous pulsing ego? Patrick followed him as Dan stalked off along the path. The dark sky was punctuated with yellow streetlights, the river wide and black on their left, and a chilly breeze sent an empty beer bottle clinking along the concrete. The rain blew into their faces, but Dan turned up his jacket collar and walked faster. Come on, Patrick wheedled from behind. Look, I'm sorry, okay? I'm sorry. Finally, he had thought to say sorry. Well, it was too late now. Everyone knew that an apology counted for nothing if you only made it out of obligation. Sorry for what? Sleeping with my wife? Or being stupid enough to tell me? Dan's fists were clenched by his sides. He was imagining breaking his brother's handsome nose, wrecking his face, pummeling the shit out of him. Don't answer that. In fact, don't say anything else. Go home. I don't want to see you. What do you mean you don't want to? I'm your brother. I'm meant to be cutting down your dead tree tomorrow morning, remember? So... Dan whirled round, glaring at him. Forget the tree. Just go. You're not welcome at my place anymore. He knew he was being melodramatic, sounding like a 5-year-old, but he couldn't stop himself. He wanted to punish Patrick for once in his life, to snatch some power back again by refusing him, rejecting him. He was due to fly to Chile in a matter of days, and right now, it didn't seem far enough. Patrick's face was yellowy beneath the streetlight, so it was hard to read his expression. He shrugged. Suit yourself, he said, then walked past Dan and further along the path. Dan watched him go for a moment, then turned off to the right, winding through the estate that led back to the main Hammersmith drag and towards his flat. Rage beat impotently through him at the fact that his brother hadn't even bothered to put up a fight. Smarting that Patrick hadn't tried harder to seek forgiveness. Suit yourself, indeed. What would suit Dan would be for the betrayal never to have happened in the first place, or at least for the whole tawdry saga to have remained silent and secret within Patrick's guilty conscience, jabbing at him now and then as a reminder of what a shit he was. A furious growl escaped his throat as he kicked out at a nearby bin, instantly regretting it for the corresponding pain that shot up his leg. That was Patrick's fault too. It was all Patrick's fault. "I can't believe you let him walk home on his own," Zoe raged the day before the funeral, when emotions were running high. "What kind of brother are you? Why couldn't you let him stay? Be the bigger man." It was a good question, one that had haunted Dan ever since, and one to which he had absolutely no answer. "It's your fault," she was effectively saying. "This is your fault. I blame you." Yet now, in a devastating new twist, it turned out that the entire fight with Patrick had been built on a lie after all. A pointless, mean lie that Patrick had told him in order to... well, what? Make Dan feel crap, no doubt. Cut off his balls just before he left on his travels. Burst his bubble good and proper. "You fucking idiot," he muttered under his breath, still standing there in the cool hall of his brother's house, with the family photos gazing silently down at him. He punched the wall, utterly distraught. What a waste, he thought, as tears pooled in his eyes and began spilling down his face. Tears of frustration and disbelief and wretchedness. Had Patrick really died for nothing? For a stupid lie? He gulped for air, crying properly now. His first tears since Patrick's death, and they weren't even fully for his brother, but for himself too. For the horrific irony of the situation. "Well, that backfired, didn't it?" he shouted miserably into the emptiness. "The joke's on you this time, Patrick." But it wasn't funny, and he wasn't laughing. Not even slightly. Chapter 25. The reverberations of the phone call with Rebecca continued to slam through Dan over the next few days. He felt numb with shock, as if nothing touched him. He didn't see or speak to anyone, just dazedly went and bought tins of cream emulsion and white gloss and set about repainting Zoe's kitchen like a robot. Every brushstroke a silent, "But why?" in his head. Had it all been a massive wind-up? If so, why had Patrick let it get so out of hand? Why, when Dan lost his cool and pushed him away, didn't Patrick own up? Say that it was a stupid joke? Granted, it wouldn't have been amusing, but at least they could have put the matter to bed, so to speak, rather than leave things festering. Rather than have Patrick stalking off alone into the night, towards his death, as it turned out. He'd been in a weird mood all evening, though, come to think of it. Preoccupied and kind of brittle. He teased Dan about Tiggy, insisting that she must fancy him and vice versa, despite Dan demurring that Tiggy really wasn't his type. "Ah, you won't be saying that after Dos cervezas, though, will you?" he said, elbowing Dan. "Eh?" Then Patrick's phone had beeped with some message or other, after which his tone had changed abruptly. "Don't listen to me, though, Dan. I'm a fuck-up, really. You go off and shag your way round the Andes while I just fuck it all up here." Patrick did get like this sometimes when he was drunk. Eeyorishly glum and prone to negative introspection. But Dan had just assumed he was wasted and hadn't paid too much attention. Patrick's life was the ideal after all. What did he have to complain about, really? Clearly something must have been going on in his head, though, for him to have come up with that whole story about Rebecca. His thoughts returned to the phone call Patrick had been in the middle of when Dan arrived at the pub that night. How agitated his brother had seemed. Had Patrick been under some enormous strain that he wanted to talk about but didn't know how? Had his brash claims later on been a misguided cry for help? Dan hated that there were still so many loose ends around his brother's death, so many uncertainties. He hated not knowing what had happened to him that night, how Patrick had ended up in the river at all and why. They'd all assumed it must have been a tragic accident, that or a violent mugging. But now Dan found himself wondering anew. What torments had Patrick been suffering that he hadn't been able to speak about? Why had he acted so badly, so out of character? "I'm sorry," he texted Rebecca on Saturday morning, feeling a pang of remorse for his tirade. Sorry, too, that he had shown his true colours at the end of the phone call, with the nasty payoff about her pregnancy. He had never thought of himself as a cruel person until now. "Really sorry, Bex. I should have had more faith in you. Patrick must have made it up to hurt me. I don't know why. That was my last conversation with him, so it's been on my mind. Sorry I said those things to you. I'm a bit of a mess. Hope you are well and happy." There. Humble and fulsome. She probably wouldn't reply. Maybe she'd even blocked him. But at least he had apologised. And painting the kitchen was proving to be soothing. A straightforward, fairly mindless task and another act of atonement for the tangle of events that had been Patrick's end. Afterwards, yes, he was glad he'd bothered to put in the effort. He'd given the entire kitchen 2 coats of cream paint with white gloss for the woodwork, and it was, although he said so himself, one hell of an improvement. The walls gleamed in the April sunshine and the room felt lighter, brighter, and a more hopeful place to be. Call it a new beginning, he thought, with a ripple of pride in his own work. A clean slate. Zoe would be delighted when she returned on Monday. For the finishing touch, he went out to the supermarket and picked up bread and milk for them. Thoughtful, he praised himself, as well as an Easter egg for each of the children as a nice surprise. Then, because it only seemed fair, he chose an egg for Jemima too, feeling a strange tightening in his chest as he added it to the trio. Well, why not? She was family after all, this mystery little niece of his. And yes, okay, because he had been looking for a reason to get in touch with Lydia again since the night of Jonathan's party. He had been unable to stop thinking about her, his memories vivid of the 2 of them dancing so wildly, the lurid cocktails they dared each other to try, and her body so close to his, the smell of her coconut shampoo. "I have a horrible feeling I might have embarrassed myself last night. I blame those cocktails," Lydia had texted the morning after, and he'd agonised over his response, wanting to be witty and charming in reply, yet ultimately feeling that he had to keep his distance. "Great night," was all he wrote in the end, bland and nothingy. She hadn't messaged again. Still, at least he had an excuse to get in touch with her now, and it came wrapped in shiny foil. "I have something for Jemima," he texted. "If you're working, I could drop it off at the shop." Lydia had replied shortly afterwards, "Week off. You could drop it round at the flat instead," and then added her address. So here he was now, parking outside her apartment block and walking up to the main door, his heart actually thumping, he realised, putting a hand to it as he pressed the bell. Was this really the good idea it had seemed back when he'd stood there in front of the shelves of confectionery? Would Lydia answer the door, glance down at the Easter egg in his hands and give him a look that said, "I see straight through you, mate"? He'd never had a good poker face, frankly. "It's Dan," he said when he heard her voice over the intercom. Then the door mechanism buzzed and he was able to push it open and walk in. Her flat was on the first floor, she'd said, so he went up the stairs, chocolate offering in hand. When he reached the landing, she was standing in her open doorway, wearing a red dress patterned with blue birds of paradise, with her hair coiled up in 2 twists on either side of her head. The style made him think of Princess Leia, which was faintly erotic in itself. "Hi there," she said. Her feet were bare, the toenails painted pastel blue, he noticed. "Do you want to come in?" He hesitated, holding up the Easter egg. "I just wanted to drop this round, but..." Why was he talking himself out of the invitation? "Yes, please," he said, as a small pirate came barrelling up to him, complete with eye patch and felt-tipped stubble. Jemima, presumably. Her upturned nose was the spit of bees, he noticed. "Hello there," he said. I mean, shiver me timbers. Who in the name of Davy Jones is this terrifying pirate? She held up a bendy foam cutlass with impressive menace. Unmistakably Patrick's daughter, with her hard stare and sweeping dark eyelashes. The thought made him feel strange. Ah! She growled. Jemima's going to a party later this afternoon, Lydia explained. Get out the way, love. Let Dan come through the door. And watch that cutlass, will you? I don't want you to stab anyone, let alone someone who's turned up with a present. Jemima's one visible eye lit up immediately. Question, did somebody say present? She asked. Do you know, I think they did, Dan replied, finding it almost impossible to keep a straight face. On first impressions, this new niece of his was pretty adorable. He held up the Easter egg on his palm, as if tempting a pony with a sugar lump. Jemima's gaze swung from the Easter egg to her mother, then back to Dan. For me? She asked, hopping from foot to foot. For tomorrow, Lydia said. From? She hesitated, caught Dan's eye, and then said, From Uncle Dan. Thank you, thank you, thank you, Jemima cried, bouncing up and down. Then she stopped and glanced suspiciously from Dan to her mum again. Wait, question. Is he your new boyfriend or something? Dan almost choked at such an ambush of a question. No, said Lydia, turning pink. No, Dan agreed gruffly, hoping his face wasn't betraying his feelings. Said Jemima, apparently unconvinced. Only Dylan at school said his mum is always bringing round these uncles, and then they turn out to be her boyfriends. She swung her cutlass through the air, then whirled away down the hall. Anyway, bye, she yelled over her shoulder. Thank you. Lydia cleared her throat, rolling her eyes. Sorry about that. She's overexcited about the party and showing off. Did I offer you a coffee? She put her hand to her face. I'm all flustered now. Why are kids so embarrassing? Dan laughed. I think it's in the job description. Coffee would be great, please. He followed her along a narrow hallway, painted bright pink and hung with photographs of Lydia and Jemima, as well as a Lego Batman poster and some splodgy finger paintings. Through an open door on the left, Dan caught sight of a cosy living room with jade green wallpaper patterned with palm leaves, a bookcase stuffed with paperbacks, and a dark purple sofa heaped with cushions. A sewing machine and piles of fabric took up one table, along with an old-fashioned sewing box, a bit like his mum's. Further on was a small modern kitchen with prints and postcards all over the walls. Plants ranged along the windowsill and the sweet, heavy smell of syrup in the air. We've been making flapjacks. Sorry about the mess, Lydia said, flapping a hand at a pile of washing up by the sink. A tray of caramel-coloured oaty flapjacks sat cooling in a tin nearby. Do you want one? They're a bit gooey. Between you and me, I think my assistant was somewhat heavy-handed with the golden syrup. Yes, please, he said, his gaze darting around the walls. Some of the things up there struck him as odd. Why would anyone stick old dressmaking patterns on the wall, he wondered. But others told stories. A good spelling certificate on the fridge, aged black and white wedding photos, presumably of Lydia's parents, and a large map of Sydney, with a small framed handwritten list beside it. Favourite places to take Liddy, he read, feeling curious. Bronte Beach, Murphy's Cafe, Rosie's Threads. So, you've recovered from last Saturday then, Lydia said, cutting the flapjacks into rectangles. Dan turned back from the list, feeling as if he'd been prying. Yes, just about, he said. The 6 o'clock emergency call from one of Patrick's tenants the next morning was pretty sobering. Oh no, nightmare, she said, laughing in sympathy. She slid 4 flapjacks onto a plate. Here, tuck in. I'll make some coffee. Does that happen a lot then? Emergency calls around the clock from irate residents. More often than you'd think, he replied, biting into the flapjack. Oh, wow, he said, as its sweetness hit him. These are good. His phone started ringing just then, and he pulled it out of his pocket only to see the words pain in arse on the screen. You are kidding me, he thought, trying not to grind his teeth in frustration. Talking of which, he said, feeling certain that Rosemary would be phoning about some non-existent problem again, like the squeaking floorboards incident, and that it wouldn't be unreasonable of him to ignore the call. But then he remembered how lonely she had seemed last time and sighed, knowing that he was a pushover. Here's one right now. Excuse me a minute. He swiped to answer it. Hello? Daniel? It's Rosemary Verlaine here. I'm ever so sorry to bother you at the weekend like this, but... Her voice quavered. I've gone and fallen over, and I'm finding it quite hard to get up again. His cynicism vanished at once. Rosemary, are you hurt? Should I call an ambulance? Heavens, no. I don't want to make a fuss. Only I tried ringing Alan, my nephew, but he's not picking up the phone. I think he said they were going to Marbella for the Easter weekend, you see, so he probably doesn't want to hear from a silly old woman on his holidays, but She sounded upset, tearful even, a different person from the charming, chatty Rosemary he knew from past visits. I'll come over, he said, before she had to ask. He'd have to go back to his flat and grab her keys from the box of Patrick-related stuff, so that he could let himself in, he thought quickly. I'll be about 40 minutes. Can you hang on that long? Are you sure you wouldn't rather I called an ambulance? Got someone to you sooner? He was dimly aware of Lydia looking anxiously at him, while Rosemary replied, Thank you, Daniel. You're very kind. No need for any bother with ambulances or anything. I've just slipped and bumped my head, but I'm not dying on the floor, I promise. Sorry to be so tiresome, dear. Only I didn't know who else to call. Dan sighed. His parents were like this too. Even when his mum had been seriously ill with pneumonia a few years ago, she'd fretted endlessly about being a bother and making a fuss. And now Rosemary was doing the same. But if he rang an ambulance and they arrived before him, she wouldn't be able to let them in, by the sound of it, and they'd have to break the door down. I'll be there as soon as I can, he promised. Chapter 26. Damn it, Dan thought, driving away a few minutes later. Of course, he didn't begrudge Rosemary for calling him, but the timing could have been better. Just as he'd successfully engineered a visit to Lydia's place, he'd been wrenched straight out of there again. Then he felt bad for his own churlishness. It wasn't as if Rosemary had chosen to fall over and hurt herself. Having arrived at her flat and let himself in, it quickly became apparent that her not wanting a fuss was wishful thinking. Dan wasn't any kind of nurse or doctor, but it was obvious even to him that she had broken her wrist and was in a lot of pain from her hip too. He knew that a broken hip was pretty catastrophic for an elderly person. His grandmother had fallen and fractured hers when she was 80, and he could still remember overhearing the doctor gravely telling his dad, "A broken hip is basically a death sentence for a woman her age, I'm afraid." "I need to get you to the hospital," he said, kneeling down beside Rosemary. She was lying in an awkward twist on the carpet, dust motes twirling in a nearby shaft of sunshine. "And I'd take you in my car, but I don't want to risk making things worse by moving you, so I'm going to call for help." Rosemary must have been feeling really bad because she didn't even argue, merely nodded, then shut her eyes. There were mascara marks beneath her lashes, Dan noticed, as he called 999. Had she been crying as she lay here alone? He couldn't bear the thought. "What a fool," she sighed, once he'd assured her the paramedics were on their way. "And now I've ruined your weekend as well. But please, there's no need for you to wait around here any longer. Just leave the door on the latch so that the ambulance people can get in and I'll be fine." "As if," he scoffed. "I'm not leaving you like this." Oh God, was that urine he could smell? How long had she been lying here anyway? He felt doubly wretched for his bad-tempered reaction earlier, when she must be suffering such embarrassment as well as pain right now. Should he mention it, or would that only make her feel worse? The latter, he decided. "Can I do anything while we wait?" he asked humbly. "Do you want me to get you something to eat or drink?" Then a thought occurred to him. If she needed surgery, if her hip was fractured, for instance, then she probably shouldn't be having either. Weren't you supposed to be nil by mouth before an operation? "I'm okay," she said, which saved that dilemma anyway. She closed her eyes again as if she'd used up all her energy with his arrival. The skin of her eyelids was translucent, her face very pale, and her hair fell in loose hanks around her shoulders. It was the first time he'd seen her without her chignon, Dan realised. She must have made an effort for him when he'd been here previously. There was something about this that he found particularly heartbreaking. The paramedics arrived within 10 minutes, confirming that Rosemary's wrist was broken. Dan could tell they were concerned about possible concussion and her hip pain as well. They gave her some painkillers before manoeuvring her skillfully onto a stretcher and out to the waiting ambulance. Then they set off to A&E, with Dan promising to lock up and follow on behind. "Daniel, there's no need. I'll be quite all right," Rosemary quavered in protest. But Dan merely raised an eyebrow and told her he'd see her at the hospital, and that was that. A short while later, having eventually found somewhere to park, he tracked her down in the X-ray waiting room, still looking ashen-faced as she lay on a trolley, but insisting that she would be absolutely fine on her own and that he really didn't need to be there. "I know I don't need to be here," he replied. "But if this had happened to my mum and I couldn't get to the hospital, I would want somebody to sit with her, okay? So no more quibbling. I'm staying." "Goodness," said Rosemary, and he was relieved to see a faint twinkle return to her eyes. "It's rather thrilling when you get all stern, Daniel. I quite like it, you know." He laughed and was about to reply when his phone bleeped with a text from Lydia. "Excuse me a minute," he said, unable to resist opening it at once. "How is she? Hope you're both okay. Kiss," he read. "Sorry, I just need to," he said, firing off a quick reply with the details. Nice of her to bother asking, he thought, feeling warm inside. He looked up to see that Rosemary was peering at him in an interested sort of way. "Is that your lady friend?" she asked. "What? Why'd you ask that?" he blustered in response. "I can tell from your face." She had definitely perked up now, Dan thought, trying not to roll his eyes. "Is this the one you were not quite talking about the other week, then? What's her name? Or his name, for that matter, obviously. I'm quite modern about these things, you know." Dan felt himself turn red. What was this? Jump to conclusions day? First Jemima lobbing in difficult questions about him and Lydia, now Rosemary. The barrage of nosiness was almost enough to make a man panic and run away. "You might as well tell me," she said. "We could be stuck here for hours, judging by that queue. Why not take pity on a poor old woman and talk me through your love life, to while away the time? Take my mind off things." On a good day, there was nothing poor old womanish about Rosemary, and they both knew it. But Dan could tell it would be impossible to try and wriggle out of this conversation, now that she had the bit between her teeth. "Well," he began. "It's quite a long story, actually." "My favourite kind," she said, looking delighted. "Tell me everything." It took a while for the whole tale to emerge, interrupted as it was by a series of X-rays, first of Rosemary's wrist and then of her hip. So, that's about the size of it, Dan finished, once they had been moved to a curtained-off cubicle to wait for a doctor. But you like her? Rosemary pressed, eyes beadily on him. Well, yes, he said, but... So what's the problem? She sounds a very nice girl, and your sister-in-law will understand, given time. I'm not so sure, Dan said glumly. I mean, this is the woman that Patrick cheated on Zoe with, who had his child. Trust me, Zoe's better off not knowing about any of that. It would destroy her, which means nothing can ever happen with Lydia. He spread his hands. Zoe already blames me for Patrick's death. I can't risk blowing things up completely over this. Rosemary blinked. She blames you for his death. But why? He'd walked right into that one. It's another long story, he muttered. Gracious, Daniel, you're like a living soap opera, she told him. But then, seeing his downcast expression, she reached out to pat his arm cautiously with her good hand. I'm sorry. This must all have been very turbulent for you. But why on earth would Zoe blame you for whatever happened to Patrick? Dan didn't have to tell her the whole thing, he knew that. And yet there was something about Rosemary's concerned, listening face that made him feel powerless to change the subject. Plus, he was still trying to make sense of everything after the phone call with Rebecca. Out it spilled, the argument over Rebecca, Dan digging his heels in for once and turning his brother away. Good gracious, said Rosemary. You have been through the ringer, haven't you? I am sorry. Dan wasn't sure he could bear her sympathy, with everything so fresh in his mind. I'm trying to put things right, he told her, followed by a brief explanation of his spreadsheet. So it's a bit like picking up brownie points for good deeds, she asked. Yes, I suppose so, he replied, although he would have preferred a slightly more manly analogy. I'm trying to help in lots of different ways, each one a secret apology, like looking after her kids and taking on Patrick's workload, things he would normally have done himself. Some extras too, for instance, painting the kitchen as a surprise while Zoe's away and... Her eyes narrowed. You painted the kitchen as a surprise, she said, without asking her first. Yeah, Dan replied, wondering why she was looking so dubious. I thought she'd be... Before he could say pleased, the curtain was pulled aside at that moment, and a doctor walked in carrying a file of notes. Mrs. Verlaine, she said, I'm Dr. McCarthy. I've just been looking at your x-rays and have some good news, but also some bad news. Rosemary gave Dan a meaningful look. To be continued, she said, then turned her attention back to the doctor. Hello, dear. Thank you so much. I'm very sorry to be a bother. What beautiful nail varnish that is, if you don't mind me saying. It's Ms. Verlaine, by the way. Never married. Unfortunately for all those men. The doctor smiled briefly. Let's start with the good news, Ms. Verlaine. Your hip isn't broken, although I gather you're experiencing some pain there. I imagine it's badly bruised, but may I take a look? Dan stood up, taking this as his cue to leave. I'll wait outside. He's embarrassed because I've been on his case about his love life, he heard Rosemary saying to the doctor as he made his way back through the curtain. And because he won't want to see my old legs either, or anything else for that matter. Safely on the other side of the curtain, Dan rolled his eyes again, even though it was hard to argue with either of Rosemary's statements. He heard the rustle of clothing and then the doctor speaking in a low voice, and what sounded like Rosemary whimpering in pain a couple of times, which was horrible to hear. He pulled his phone out from his jeans pocket, needing something to do with his hands, and clicked on a sports app to see what was happening in the football that afternoon. He had started keeping an eye on how Fulham were doing so that he had another thing to talk to Gabe about. But before the page had even loaded, he heard a voice saying, "Dan?" and looked up, only to see, astonished, that Lydia was there in the hospital corridor, walking towards him. "Hi," he said, taken aback. He almost wanted to rub his fists into his eyes and check again, like a cartoon character, because he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. "What are you doing here?" She was carrying a cloth bag, which she handed over to him. "It sounded as if you might be here a while, so I brought you some provisions. How is she? And are you okay?" He was so touched that he couldn't actually speak for a moment. "That's so kind of you. Thank you." He could see cling-filmed sandwiches inside the bag, as well as a couple of apples, plus a tinfoil-wrapped package. "She's in there," he added, indicating the curtain with his head. "Her hip's not broken at least, but—" "Daniel," he heard Rosemary call at that moment. "Who are you talking to?" His mouth went dry. Oh no, he did not want the two of them to meet, not after he'd just poured his feelings out to Rosemary. Knowing her, she wouldn't be able to resist stirring things up with great glee. "A friend," he called back, pulling a face at Lydia. Hello," Lydia said. Goodness knows what the doctor made of her patient's through-the-curtain nosiness. But then it got worse because they heard Rosemary saying to her in thrilled tones, "Well, I never. I think that might be the beautiful lady friend that Daniel's been telling me all about. This is exciting." Dan cringed. Talk about wishing the ground could swallow you up. "We can hear you, you know," he said, unable to look at Lydia anymore. "Sorry," he mumbled in her vague direction. "If you could keep still a moment, please," the doctor said to Rosemary, who clearly wasn't paying any attention because she was too busy issuing instructions of her own. "Well, open the curtain then, Daniel. Come in. I'd like to say hello properly, seeing as she's made such an effort." Dan shot Lydia an agonized look, although she seemed more on the verge of laughter than being embarrassed or offended. "It's fine," she hissed. "Are you sure you're decent in there?" Dan checked, only to have a very impatient yes in response. "Okay then," he sighed, mouthing, "Really sorry about this," to Lydia. Then he pulled back the curtain. "Lydia, Rosemary, Rosemary, Lydia," he said. "Lydia has kindly brought us some food." "What a darling," Rosemary sighed, looking Lydia up and down and nodding with approval, before making a very unsubtle thumbs-up sign to Dan. "Give me strength," he thought, trying not to groan aloud. "So, you're Lydia," Rosemary said. "And you've come all this way to see Daniel. Well, I never. You must like him a great deal." "Rosemary, that's enough. Behave yourself," Dan said. There was only so much blatant mischief-making he could take. "As I was just telling Ms. Verlaine," Dr. McCarthy said, "her wrist is broken in 2 places and she'll need to stay in for surgery. Are you the next of kin?" she asked Dan. "No," he said. "I'm her—" He glanced over at Rosemary, who was propped up on the bed with a blanket covering her legs. "Landlord, I suppose. And friend." "Okay, so we're going to admit Ms. Verlaine for the night, treat that wrist as soon as possible, and keep an eye on her," the doctor said. "There are no visible signs of a head injury, but we will continue to monitor her for the time being. Ms. Verlaine, is there anyone we could contact for you? Perhaps somebody who could bring you a couple of items from home, toiletries and a nightdress, that sort of thing?" Said Rosemary. And Dan could tell she was about to launch into her not wanting to be a bother spiel again. "I can go back and get a few things for you," he said. "If you'd like me to, I mean." Rosemary's mouth wobbled a little. "Thank you, darling. That would be so kind, if you don't mind." Of course, in the next minute she was looking over at Lydia with an eyebrow raised. "He's a proper gentleman, isn't he? Heavens, if I wasn't so ancient, I'd be after him myself." The doctor said she would add Rosemary to the list for surgery, and that yes, it was fine to eat and drink before the operation, as she'd only be having a local anaesthetic. She would see if there was space on a ward for her, but in the meantime they could stay put. Then she went off to her next patient, looking rather glad to escape, Dan thought. Rosemary turned her full attention on Lydia. "That's a beautiful dress you're wearing, dear," she said. Lydia's hands flew up to her chest. "Oh, thank you," she said, looking pleased. "I made it myself." "Did you? Very good. I love the mandarin collar," Rosemary said, peering beadily. "And the frogging across the throat is divine. Goodness, you are clever." She turned to Dan, who had only managed to follow half of the conversation. "I used to teach at the London College of Fashion, I'll have you know. I haven't always been a mouldy oldie." "Rosemary," scolded Dan, "nobody thinks that." "Oh my God," said Lydia. "Seriously? I applied to study there." "What? And they turned you down?" "What idiots," Rosemary clucked. "That dress really is very good, you know. And I'm a curmudgeon. I wouldn't say it if I didn't mean it." "Thank you. They did offer me a place, but, well, life got in the way," said Lydia. She looked sad for a moment, then rearranged her face. "Anyway, I'd better go. I need to pick up Jemima from her party in 20 minutes. Can't keep a pirate waiting." "Good to see you," Dan said. Should he lean in and give her a hug? No, she was already moving towards the curtain and out of there. Shall I walk you to your car?" he asked. "I got the bus," she said. "It's fine. Bye. Hope you feel better soon, Rosemary." "Thank you," Rosemary said. Barely had Lydia closed the curtain and left than she was leaning forward, eyes bright, and saying to Dan, "Well, fancy that. How lovely of her. And by the way, she definitely likes you back, Daniel. Definitely." "Rosemary," Dan hissed, glancing at the curtain, which wasn't exactly soundproof. Truly, had there ever been a less discreet person in the history of the world? "Let's see what's in here then," he said to distract her, and unpacked the picnic that Lydia had brought. The tinfoil package contained 4 flapjacks, he discovered, and the smell took him back to the warmth of her kitchen earlier on. It seemed a long time ago already. "Cheese or ham?" he asked Rosemary, proffering the sandwiches. "Thank you," she said, plucking one from the cling film. "And now you'd better tell me about this fabulous career of yours," he said to her, sitting down on the plastic chair beside the bed. "You dark horse, you. London College of Fashion, eh? You kept that quiet." There was a faraway gleam in her eye, perhaps as she reflected on past glories. "Well," she said, smiling, "seeing as you asked." "Wait," he said, shuffling about in the chair to get comfortable. "Okay, I'm ready. Tell me everything." Rosemary spluttered on her sandwich. "Oh, Daniel," she said fondly. "I am glad you're here." He smiled back at her. "Me too," he replied. Chapter 27. It was Easter Sunday, and Rebecca had left a voicemail on Dan's phone. "I'm sorry too," she said. "Sorry for what you're going through, and for what I said about Patrick. He gave me a ton of shit in the street once after we split up. Did you know that? I'm not telling you this to have a pop, more to remind you that he did love you. Remember that speech he made at our wedding? I still get goosebumps thinking about it. Anyway, I hope you're okay and that Zoe's bearing up. Take care." Her words were so unexpectedly nice that they brought tears to Dan's eyes, and he ended up listening to the message 3 times over as he drove to the hospital. Patrick had never mentioned the incident in the street. Dan felt quite saucer-eyed just imagining the scene. What had been said? But hearing about it now made him feel good too. Comforted. And for Rebecca to bother leaving him the message at all meant a lot to him. She had seen past his ugly words and had been kind. He felt not mended exactly, but as if something broken was finally healing. Having delivered home a patched-up Rosemary, he found himself looking around her flat with renewed interest, now that he knew more about her life story. The rags-to-riches tale of her having been an impoverished dressmaker who began designing her own fashions in the 60s, selling them first in Portobello Market, before being taken under the wing of an influential woman who was already working in the fashion industry. She went on to launch a range of clothes in a Carnaby Street boutique, branched out into costume design for the theatre and then the movie industry, as well as being invited to lecture on prestigious design courses in London and New York. She always dressed immaculately. He'd noticed that much. But now Dan registered the sewing machine on a corner table in the living room, the design books on the shelves, the stylish decor of the place, and it fitted with the story she had told him. Sad, though, that the tale did not have a happier ending. "So, how come you ended up renting a flat from my brother?" he'd asked the day before, curiosity getting the better of his tact. Sorry, that came out wrong. She waved aside his blustering. "It's called a fall from grace," she replied with a sigh, before going on to detail how she'd clashed with a couple of big industry names. "Once you're out, darling. That's the problem." Then made some bad investment decisions, and basically spent all the money without having much of a savings safety net. "Born with nothing, die with nothing. That'll be me," she said with a laugh. "I never bought a house or started a pension. I just enjoyed myself and had a marvellous time. And do you know what else? I don't regret a minute of it." It had been sobering for Dan, having to completely rethink his perception of Rosemary to include this whole colourful backstory, to realise that her life had once been vibrant and exciting. In her prime, she'd been a powerhouse, a dazzling young woman bursting with creativity, only to be reduced years later to the label of pain in arse on her landlord's phone. Dan had patronised her, been irritated by her, but in fact she had achieved way more with her life than he or Patrick had managed. Having promised to drop in and see her again soon, he headed on to his parents' house, where his mum was hosting Easter lunch. "It'll be about 20 minutes, Liz said, apron-clad and pink in the cheeks as she kissed him on arrival. A comforting smell of roast lamb and mint sauce wafted out from the kitchen, and as she led him through to get him a drink, Dan could see that the special red tablecloth had made its biannual appearance, Christmas and Easter only, on the dining room table, along with a jug of yellow tulips. "You look nice," Dan said, taking in his mum's floral dress and coiffed hair. "Yes, well," she said with a self-conscious shrug. "I felt like making an effort today, for church. And, well, for me too, I suppose." "Good," said Dan, sliding a bottle of wine into the fridge. Seeing her looking more like her old self again was so comforting that he actually had a lump in his throat. It was only a dress and some blow-drying at the end of the day, but it also signalled her strength, her courage. The world seemed a tiny bit more normal, now that Liz Shepherd had her lipstick on again. "Your aunt and uncle are in the living room, if you want to say hello," she went on, as if that was quite enough talk about herself. "Although," she wagged a finger at him, "don't you go moving that bloody photograph again, son. I'm on to you. Every time." "Oh," he said, rumbled. I hate that photo, he muttered as the image swam up in his mind. Patrick grabbing him in a headlock on the beach, victorious and jeering. The look of frightened servitude in his own eyes. He could practically hear the mocking cries of the seagulls in the sky above, even now. "Why do you hate it?" she asked in surprise. "It's one of my favourites." Dan couldn't believe that she had to ask. "Because he's picking on me. He's practically strangling me by the look of things, and grinning about it, like it's all a big game. It makes me feel humiliated, that's all." His face felt hot. More emotional honesty. It was actually quite liberating, though, being able to express yourself with such frankness. To say stuff out loud. Who knew? "What? No," she said, shaking her head. "That wasn't what happened at all. He just rescued you from another boy who was, I don't know, throwing stones at you, roughing you up a bit. Don't you remember?" Dan stared at her blankly, having no idea, no memory of what she was talking about. "That's not how I remember it," he said. "Yes, definitely. Ask your dad if you don't believe me. We had gone to Brighton for the day and were down on the beach. You boys rushed off with a load of other kids to play while your dad and I were setting out the picnic. This boy made you cry about something anyway, and Patrick saw that you were upset, went over there and sorted everything out. He was protecting you, Daniel. Then he brought you back over to where we were sitting, all triumphant and pleased with himself. That was why Dad took the picture, because he wanted to capture the moment." Dan couldn't speak for a few seconds. He couldn't take it in, couldn't square this story with his own version of events. Previously, the photograph had always represented Patrick's superiority over him, Dan the loser. It was unsettling to hear his mum recounting a wholly different story. "Are you sure?" he asked eventually. 100%. Your dad will say the same if you ask him. Patrick was a good brother to you, Daniel. We were proud of the way he used to look after you like that." She pulled open the oven door, which released a great plume of steam, then leaned forward to check the roast potatoes. "So leave that picture where it is now and be grateful for him, okay?" she added in a muffled voice. Dan was still in a daze. "Okay," he said. The following day, Easter Monday, Dan decided to give himself a break. He had worked tirelessly over the last few weeks, pouring all his energy into picking up the slack in his brother's absence, doing his best to make up for Patrick not being there. Today, though, he would please himself for a change. Look after number one. The plan could have a day off. First things first, inspired by Mark, he went for a long, invigorating run along the river and back again, followed by a hot shower and a massive fry-up. Then he spent some time out in his garden, cutting the grass and tidying up the straggling honeysuckle. The tree was still there, as dead as ever, but he kept his back to it most of the time, and that was all right. Besides, he was going to get round to sorting it out any day now. Ever since he'd been looking after Patrick's properties, Dan had picked up the habit of glancing over a place with a critical eye, seeking potential problems that needed attention. Today he found himself doing exactly this with his own flat, seeing it anew. The kitchen window frames, for instance, were starting to rot where the paint had flaked away, and the rear guttering was looking kind of rickety. So he spent a pleasant hour or so making a list of what needed to be done. The handyman he'd taken on to deal with the Hussein's house was doing a good job so far, he'd noticed. He would ask him to provide a quote for the work that needed tackling here as well. By the time he broke for lunch, he was feeling pleased about how productive he was being, how satisfying it felt to get on top of the life admin like this. The secrets he had carried around with him since Patrick's death had been weighty and cumbersome, but today he felt less burdened, as if he had temporarily put them to one side. It felt good to focus on his own matters for a change. He hadn't realised how caught up he had been in other people's lives until now. Then the doorbell rang. Easter Monday was an odd time to have an unexpected caller, he thought, as he went to answer it. Unless it was some religious nut trying to give him a pamphlet about Jesus, he supposed. Back when he and Rebecca had been together, friends of hers would occasionally drop round with a bottle of wine or a bag of pastries from the bakery. Just passing. But that had all stopped when they split up, of course. Hardly anyone ever came round to see him, he realised with a jolt as he reached the door. In fact, when was the last time anyone else had even been in this flat, other than himself? "Zoe," he said in surprise, opening the door and seeing her there. She was red in the face as she walked in and shut the door behind her. "The children are in the car and I don't want them to see me shouting at you," she said. Her hands were curled into fists, he noticed in alarm, and her expression was extremely fierce. "But what the hell, Dan? What the hell were you playing at?" He swallowed. Oh my God, had she found out about Lydia? He thought with a flash of panic. But then he remembered Rosemary's reaction when he told her what he'd done. Without asking her first? "Is this about the kitchen?" he guessed. "Too bloody right it's about the kitchen," she said. "What were you thinking? It's not your house. Why on earth did you think it was your place to do that?" "Because..." His nerve faltered. Oh shit. Had he made a terrible mistake? "I thought it would be a nice... surprise." "It was a surprise, all right. Not exactly the surprise I wanted either, having just driven all the way back from South Wales." She glared at him and folded her arms across her chest, perhaps to stop herself from punching him. "Patrick was the last person to paint that kitchen," she went on. "And that was fine because, you know, he lived there too. But..." "I'm sorry," he mumbled. "I thought it would..." "You painted over our height chart. Did you realise that?" she yelled. "We've been marking the kids' heights for years and years." Tears appeared in her eyes. "And you painted over that. It was precious to me. It was so, so precious." With a horrible jolt, Dan remembered the strange series of lines penciled against the door jamb that he had blithely gloss-painted over. His mind had been on the fallout from Rebecca's call. He hadn't thought to question what they might be. No wonder Zoe was upset. "I'm sorry," he said again, feeling wretched. "I didn't realise, but I honestly thought you would be pleased." There was a short silence, which told Dan, as if he didn't already know, that no, Zoe was not pleased. She was very, very far from being pleased, in fact. "I know you want to help, and you've been very helpful," she said, although the words were snarled rather than said with any fondness. "But you totally overstepped the mark there. How would you feel?" And now she was striding down the hall and into the kitchen. "If I did the same to you?" He followed her, his stomach turning over as he remembered that the good deeds spreadsheet was right there on the fridge, each column carefully filled with achievements, but she was like an unstoppable force. "If I just changed these crappy blinds of yours without asking." She flicked at them with contempt. "If I ripped up your shitty lino and put a different one down, without even checking you liked it." She kicked at it. "If I took out your cupboards, replaced your fridge." And then, oh God, she was standing right in front of it before he could stop her. An image came to mind of him rugby tackling her away, but then it was too late. "Hey," she said, peering closer. Her voice changed to something sharp and cold. "What the hell is this?" "The Patrick plan." Dan's knees felt as if they could no longer support him all of a sudden. His head swam with attempts to excuse himself, but nothing seemed valid. Mending Mrs. Henderson's boiler, taking Ethan to sculpture club, she read aloud. Fixing Zoe's car. What is this? Meeting Lydia. Who the fuck is Lydia? Dan shut his eyes, wishing this was not happening. It was like a bad dream, except it was playing out in real life, right now. Skateboarding with Gabe, Easter egg for kids. Zoe went on reading. Oh, here we are. Painting Zoe's kitchen. She snatched the chart off the fridge and swung round with it, eyes like lasers searing into him. Dan, help me out here. I really need to know what the hell this is all about. Oh, Christ. When the day had been going so well, too. I was just trying to help, he said weakly. Awarding yourself points for each thing you did. How big of you? Zoe didn't seem able to take her eyes off the paper she was holding. Buying the kids fish and chips for tea. When even was this? It was when you stormed out that first night, he confessed. Her eyes blazed. What? I left a perfectly good dinner cooking, she reminded him angrily, and you felt you had to ditch it and buy them all junk food instead. It wasn't like that, he said. The sausages burned. I ruined it. Not on purpose. And I wanted to treat them so... Wanted to win them over, more like. She sneered, turning back to the list. Tenant visit. VAT return completed. Visit to Mum and Dad. Jesus, Dan. Can't you even go and see your own parents without patting yourself on the back? I mean, I thought you were doing these things out of kindness. Because you liked spending time with us. What an idiot I must be. I do like spending time with... Because it was only ever about you, right? You've made this whole thing about you. Dan to the rescue. She sneered. I just wanted to step in for Patrick, he said. To try and make life easier for you and the kids. To ease your conscience, you mean, she said. And who is Lydia anyway? Is she one of the tenants? Only I don't remember hearing her name before. There was a terrible pause. The easy option dangled in front of Dan like a lifebelt offered to a drowning man. He could simply say yes, couldn't he? Yes, she's a tenant. Tell a white lie, so as not to make this any worse. Dan, she prompted. Who is she? He leaned against the worktop and stared down at the floor, the words sticking in his throat. He couldn't do it to her. Dan, she yelled. For fuck's sake, what is it? You're freaking me out now. Tell me. Dan's stomach shriveled. Should he go there? He couldn't. But Zoe was glaring so fiercely at him that the words fell out anyway. She told me that she and Patrick had a fling, he said miserably, and the air around them seemed to seize, as if the room was holding its breath. No turning back now. And she has a daughter. Patrick's daughter. What? Zoe flinched as if she'd been slapped and took a step back. She was blinking fast, a hand flying up to her throat. I don't believe you. Zoe, why would you say such a vile thing to me? Why would you do that, Dan? She screwed up the paper and hurled it to the floor. God, you have got some nerve. You've always been jealous of him, haven't you? So pathetically jealous. Even when he's dead, you're trying to get one over on him by saying these disgusting things. He ventured another glance at her, only to see Zoe's features contorted by a mix of rage and hatred. Look, I was as shocked as you are, he said feebly, but she was still going. Well, guess what? You're not Patrick. You've never been as good as Patrick. And do you know what? You should live your own life for a change, rather than trying to hang on the coattails of your dead brother, my dead husband. appropriating his life, his work, his family, like you have any right to do that. Even worse, bad-mouthing him like that to me. How dare you say those things about him? He was worth 10 of you, 1,000 of you. Zoe, if you have ever cared about me or the kids, you will never say another word about this woman in my presence or to anyone else. Do you hear me? With that, she stormed from the room, marching back towards the front door. Just leave us alone, was her parting shot as she slammed out of the house.
This is the end of CD 8. The book continues on CD 9. CD 9.
Chapter 28. The walls seemed to echo with Zoe's departure. Dan didn't move for a few moments, trying to absorb the shock. His eye fell on the crumpled piece of paper on the floor that had been his main purpose in recent weeks, and he let out a low groan of despair that he could have got everything so very wrong. "You should live your own life for a change," Zoe had yelled, and the words kept stinging because they were true. He had stepped into Patrick's shoes and he had enjoyed it, taking on the mantle of the busy property developer, the caring dad. "Look at me, how well I'm doing this," he had crowed to himself as he sorted out everyone's problems and gave them his attention. He had even, on occasion, relished a stab of pride at how much better he was at dealing with situations than Patrick had been. The Husseins, yes, but also the moment when Ethan had come out to him. The big hero. Wasn't it telling that he'd felt a spurt of competitive one-upmanship even then? Now Zoe was calling Dan out on it, and she was right. He had gone too far, overstepped a boundary. It wasn't much of a competition after all, when your competitor was dead. And then he had made everything 100 times worse by telling her about Lydia. He grimaced, remembering how she had flinched, the shock and hurt on her face. The secret was well and truly out now, but he didn't feel any lighter for it. In fact, he only felt sickened by himself for blurting out the truth so clumsily. And for what? For Zoe to turn on him, tear him down. He kept thinking about the contempt in her eyes and could hardly bear it. He reached over, picked up the printed spreadsheet and began ripping it into pieces. Like a stupid chart could ever make up for the loss of a loved one. A father, husband, son. All those jobs and favours Dan had been so eager to complete. They felt meaningless in the face of his sheer ineptitude. How would he be able to put things right now? He couldn't imagine Zoe ever forgiving him for this. The flat seemed to be closing in around him, so he grabbed his keys and jacket, then went out, suddenly needing to gulp in lungfuls of fresh air. He stuffed his hands in his pockets and headed in the direction of the river, under the flyover that thundered with end-of-bank holiday traffic, and down towards Lower Mall. A plane hung in the sky on its way to Heathrow, and Dan found himself wishing he had left the country and gone to South America after all, and not got involved with any of this. Imagine. He'd never have become entangled with Patrick's business, or the tenants, or the paperwork, or the 7 hours spent in hospital waiting rooms on Saturday. He'd been tanned and lean after days spent hiking the Inca Trail. His Spanish would have improved tenfold. He'd have explored jungles and mountains and great beaches and met people from around the world. Maybe fallen in love beneath the vast star-spangled skies of the Pampas. He'd be carefree, a different man. Then again, if he had gone to South America, he wouldn't have met Lydia, a voice in his head pointed out. He wouldn't have got to know his nephews and nieces any better. He wouldn't have spent all this extra time with his own parents. He wouldn't have gone skateboarding or learned about sculptures or unicorns. Was it too corny of him to say that he wouldn't have learned about all the different ways you could love people? Probably. But it was true. He leaned against the wall, gazing wretchedly down at the river below, watching a clutch of gulls peck at the mud and shingle of its banks. A couple of men in high-vis tops were out in kayaks, paddling steadily through the water alongside one another. Brothers, he wondered, or just friends? Was it ever possible to be both? His dad had taken him and Patrick mudlarking a couple of times when they were boys, and they'd found a clay pipe once. He couldn't remember which of them had discovered it now, only that they both wanted it and had such a terrible fight about who was going to keep it that the pipe had got broken, and their exasperated father had said he wouldn't take them out again if they were going to be such brats. So they'd both ended up losing out. Twice over. He was worth 10 of you. 1,000 of you. Zoe shouted in his head, and Dan cringed afresh. Oh God, what had he done? He walked past the rowing club, the pubs, a house that was rather optimistically called Beach House, and on towards the Dove Pier. He paused to gaze out at all the houseboats moored there, some with amazing gardens growing on their decks, others with buckets and ropes and pulleys piled up. He thought about his own, far less romantic home. Somewhere to sleep and eat breakfast, a holding place in between stints at the office. But he didn't want to live like that anymore. Leave us alone, Zoe had yelled, and he wondered uneasily about the extent to which she meant this. Did she want him to stop working on Patrick's houses? Drop contact with the tenants and leave all of that to her? Worse, did she mean for him to no longer see the children? She had seemed so hurt and angry that he could imagine her driving them home, saying, "You're not going to see Uncle Dan again. Do you understand? We're better off without him." The thought was unbearable. "Sorry," he groaned under his breath. To Patrick, to Zoe, to the kids. He wished she had let him explain that, okay, maybe filling the columns of the chart with practical favours and assistance had started out as an obligation, a framework that he felt safe within, but the project had quickly grown into one of love, that he had cherished being part of their family, felt himself become a better person for it. That yes, he might have helped them out here and there, but they had given him so much in return. He slumped onto a bench in Furnival Gardens, feeling numb as the world carried on around him. Cyclists skimmed by, an elderly couple walked a roomy-eyed poodle. A lycra-clad woman with pink headphones jogged past, checking something on a fitness tracker. He didn't know what to do with himself. It was a bank holiday and the rest of the country seemed to be entertaining themselves just fine. But he felt frozen to the spot, unable to make any decisions. Without his good deeds spreadsheet shoring up the week, he had lost all sense of purpose. He felt as if the mask he'd been wearing over the last month had been ripped away, revealing a small, shabby person beneath. If he wasn't careful, he might end up like this for the rest of his life, alone and bitter. His thoughts turned to Rosemary, lying on the floor after her fall, embarrassed and smelling of piss, with only her landlord to help her. It was like a warning premonition, a glimpse into a possible future that awaited him. So what should he do? "Mummy," said Bea, clambering up onto the bed next to Zoe and lying beside her. "Why are you crying? Are you sad about Daddy?" Zoe had managed to wrestle down her distress all the way back from Dan's house, but now that she was home and lying on her own bed, it was no longer possible to maintain the floodgates. Every time she shut her eyes, she kept seeing Dan's stupid, stricken face, and worse, his printed spreadsheet keeping score of all the things he'd done for her in the last month, like she was some kind of charity case. To think that she'd begun to warm to him again lately, rely on him, confide in him even. And yet it was all for a printed list stuck up there on his fridge, his warped means of making himself feel better about the part he'd played in Patrick's death. It was just so cold, so calculating. What had happened to doing things for other people out of the goodness of your heart? As for the rubbish Dan had said about Patrick, it didn't even make sense. Dan had always been gullible when it came to women. Look how Rebecca had treated him. But even so, he had got this spectacularly wrong. Zoe felt insulted that he could even have believed such nonsense. "Yes, darling," she managed to croak, pulling Bea in close to her. "I'm sad about Daddy today." "I'm sad too, because it's school tomorrow, and I miss my Nine and Tide, and the beach, and Uncle Niall and Fozzie." Bea wriggled up a little so that their faces were very close and stroked Zoe's cheek. "We're both sad together, aren't we, Mummy?" "We are, my love," Zoe said, her eyes brimming with tears again. "We're sad together. Let's hold each other tight for a moment." They lay there, arms across one another, Bea nestling her head under Zoe's chin. Forget Dan, she told herself, feeling comfort from her daughter's empathy, as well as the warm softness of her body. Forget his naff plan and his terrible accusations. She didn't need him or his so-called help. She had family and friends standing loyally by her. She had her children and her memories of Patrick to keep herself strong. They'd had such a lovely time in Penarth, with the children laughing and more relaxed than she'd seen them in ages. All three of them had seen different people, herring around on the beach together with the dog, whooping and screeching. Ethan had lost the bags under his eyes for once. Gabe hadn't started a single fight. Bea had slept soundly in her own bed every night. So had Zoe. The warm welcome they'd received had cast a calming enchantment on them all, only for Zoe to completely lose her shit on returning home to see what Dan had done to the kitchen. But she could return to that calm place, she reminded herself, in her head, if not in person. She could breathe deeply and imagine the sea and remember the lightness she had felt, crunching across the beach in pursuit of her racing children. "You're doing great," her mum told her as they hugged goodbye that morning. "And we're always here whenever you need us." She sighed, wondering if her mum would still think she was doing so great if she'd seen her just now over at Dan's. Had she overreacted to the paint job? It had been such a shock to walk in there and find the place transformed like that. It hadn't felt like her home anymore. Rationally, she knew Dan was only trying to be kind, but it felt like an intrusion, as if he was judging her and her messy house and being too quick off the mark to smarten them up. Maybe it was petty, but she'd wanted to hang on to everything Patrick had ever done for her, preserve it for as long as possible, rather than paint it out of sight. She knew that the height chart they'd created over the years was not the most important thing in the world. It was just lines on a wall. But it had meant something to her, representing the years and years of family life, her children growing up, and the 5 of them sharing that time together. She had flipped anyway, lost that famous temper of hers, bundled everyone back in the car and driven over to Dan's house like a maniac. And then, when she saw that moronic list of his, it had been like an arrow to the heart. "What, you thought I was doing this because I liked you all? Not really." Her memory kept replaying the scene in her head, and she tightened her arms around Bea as she reached the most dreadful moment of all, when he started making accusations about Patrick and some woman or other. Was he deliberately trying to hurt her? He must have got the wrong end of the stick, fallen for a con artist. He must have. Wait. Something occurred to her. Lydia, he had said. Where had she heard that name before? Bea wriggled free just then. Too hot, Mummy. Sorry. She hadn't realised quite how tightly she had been squeezing the poor thing. Bea studied her intently, her breathing loud and warm against Zoe's face. If Daddy was here, I know what he would say. Come on, you two. Enough moping around now. Zoe gulped, because her daughter's intonation was so like Patrick's. It was as if he were in the room with them, conjured up by the little girl's impression. You are absolutely right, she said, trying to get a grip on her feelings. Enough moping around now. Yes, that was exactly what Patrick would have said, and he'd have been right. This was the last day of the school holidays. She would block out the horrible conversation with Dan as best she could and slap on a brave face. She could do that. Hell, she was an expert by now. Sitting up, Zoe hugged her daughter, trying to squash her sadness back down. Thank you, Bea, she said. That was just what I needed to hear. No more moping. She swallowed hard, pushed her damp hair out of her eyes, and squared her shoulders. But as she and Bea went downstairs together in search of something fun to do, Dan's words kept sliding insidiously into her head. She told me that she and Patrick had a fling. She has a daughter. It couldn't be true, could it? It just couldn't. All the same, Zoe couldn't help but rack her brains to remember where she'd met someone called Lydia recently. Because as soon as she remembered, this woman, this liar, would be sorry. Chapter 29. Hi, massive apologies again. It honestly came from wanting to be a good brother-in-law and uncle, that's all. I'm sorry. I am happy to continue looking after the business until I'm back at work, but we'll drop off all the paperwork, etc., if you'd rather I didn't do it anymore. Dan. Another day, another apologetic text. Overcome by the guilty feeling he had bungled everything, Dan had contacted Zoe on Monday evening, but no reply had come and he didn't dare push the matter. Did she hate him? It had certainly looked that way when she stormed out of his house. The last thing he wanted was to hurt her, but he was pretty sure he had, very badly. Again. It was sod's law that a delivery arrived for him that morning, which turned out to be the superhero costume he'd ordered for Gabe's party the following weekend. Thor, Gabe's favourite. The costume came with a red flowing cape, padded six-pack moulded armour, a blonde wig and a plastic hammer. How ironic. He stuffed it all back in the packaging, unable to look at it. Was he still even welcome at the party? Over in the shop, Lydia's eye was caught by a woman walking past the window with long brown hair, like her mum's, and she was catapulted straight back into one of her favourite memories. She must have been about 12 when she first got to grips with her mum's sewing machine and discovered the joys of making cushion covers and a simple tote bag. And then one day Eleanor had taken her to Goldhawk Road, just the two of them, to browse around the many fabric shops there. Eleanor Fox had been a fantastic needlewoman, making clothes for the whole family, her own wedding dress even. The low hum of the sewing machine had been the sound that Lydia fell asleep to all through her childhood. I think you're ready to start using proper dressmaking patterns, Eleanor had said thrillingly as they entered the first shop, and Lydia's heart had leapt to see all the rolls and rolls of different fabrics lined up. So many shades and patterns. Her mum had squeezed Lydia's hand as if she shared her daughter's excitement. Let's treat ourselves. She could still remember the sewing pattern she'd chosen that day. She probably still had it somewhere in a box of craft stuff. A simple round neck dress with a high-low hemline. Ooh, nice, her mum said approvingly. Now, what fabric would you like? The finished dress would not have won any prizes, admittedly. It suffered from some wayward, clumsy seams, and the zip at the back never quite sat flat. but it marked the start of a love affair in earnest between Lydia and the needle. Over the years, it became a ritual. She and Eleanor taking the bus to Goldhawk Road together to choose a new pattern each, fabric and buttons and thread. "When you're older, maybe 18, I'll take you to my favourite sewing shop in Sydney," her mum had once said over a post-shopping hot chocolate in a cafe near the bus stop. "Would you like that?" Forever after, Lydia had associated the taste of hot chocolate with sheer happiness. "Really? I would love that," she had replied. Sewing remained a communication channel between mother and daughter for the rest of the time they had together. When Lydia was 15, Eleanor bought her own sewing machine, and the two of them often commandeered the kitchen table in the evenings so that they could sew away companionably together. They made each other birthday and Christmas gifts, a skirt, a bag, embroidered cushion covers. "I'm so jealous," her mum sighed when Lydia showed her the prospectus for the London College of Fashion. "Hey, do you think they'd let an oldie like me enroll too? Wouldn't that be something?" Even when her mum became ill and lost her hair, Lydia made her light chiffon scarves to wrap around her head. Every stitch an "I love you," every seam a "please get better." The shop door jangled just then and Lydia blinked out of her reverie. She'd been miles away, she realised, turning to greet the customer. But said customer was already speaking, loud and angry. "What the hell," she asked, marching up to the counter, "is your fucking game?" Lydia stared in shock. First, because nobody ever raised their voice in this shop, and second, because the customer in front of her was Zoe, Patrick's wife, looking puce in the face, fists clenched as if she was about to hit her. What? She stuttered. "It is you, isn't it? On Dan's chart. Lydia, you must think I'm some kind of idiot." No," said Lydia, trying to get her head around this. "Dan's chart? You planned this from the start, I'm guessing. You took advantage of me, found out who I was, and then went planting lies left, right, and centre." "What? No." Was the woman crazy? This furious outburst was the exact inverse of Zoe's first appearance in the shop when she'd been limp with grief, practically unable to support her own weight, her face puffy with tears. Now she was rigid with anger, eyes blazing, one finger stabbing the air with each accusation. "I've no idea what this is all about," Lydia stammered. "Yeah, right." The words dripped with sarcasm. "Lying that you had a child with my husband. You're like some kind of parasite. You disgust me." "Everything all right?" said Jonathan, coming in from the back room. He was carrying a coffee each for Lydia and himself, and his startled gaze swung from one woman to the next. Then his eyes narrowed. "Can I help you?" he asked, a hint of steel entering his voice. "Ask your psychopath colleague," Zoe said, trembling. "I should sue you for slander," she added, turning back to Lydia. "How could you? Preying on a vulnerable woman, trying to get your hands on my money, I'm guessing. Well, forget it." Then, without warning, she grabbed the nearest object off the shelf beside her, a tall dip-dyed vase, and hurled it at Lydia. Lydia ducked, but the vase hit the wall behind her and shattered into pieces. "For fuck's sake!" Jonathan shouted, putting down the mugs and striding over towards Zoe. "Get out of my shop right now, or I'm calling the police. Lydia, are you all right? Are you hurt?" Gulping and tearful, Zoe wheeled around towards the exit. Just as she was pushing the door open, Lydia recovered herself enough to shout, "I'm not lying. It's all true. It's all true." The door slammed behind Zoe, and Lydia's knees began to shake. Jonathan came over and put an arm round her. "Who was that lunatic?" "Are you okay?" he asked. Lydia was trembling all over, her heart pounding. What on earth was all that about? Dan was out running again, this time along the riverside in Barnes, when his phone rang. He slowed to a walk, fumbling to retrieve it from his pocket. "Hello," he said, breath puffing out of him. "I've just had your sister-in-law in the shop," Lydia said, without preamble, red in the face and screaming at me. Threw a £100 vase at my head too, which smashed everywhere. Why didn't you think to warn me she knew? Not that she was admitting to knowing anything. She seemed to be completely in denial. Accused me of making the whole thing up. "Oh, God," said Dan, stopping completely. All the blood rushed to his head. "How did she... Shit." Then he remembered the crumpled spreadsheet. Who the fuck is Lydia? He groaned. Zoe must have gone flicking through her mental folder of Lydia's, recalled his reaction when he first saw that business card on her fridge, and put two and two together, he guessed. "Wait, did you say she'd thrown a vase at your head?" he asked, catching up with Lydia's words. Had Zoe become completely deranged? "Are you all right?" "Yeah, no harm done, well, apart from the vase, and me feeling really embarrassed in front of Jonathan." Dan exhaled, a long rush of dismay. "I'm so sorry," he said. "Zoe and I had a bit of a bust-up yesterday. She came over and, well, everything's gone wrong, basically. She's really angry with me, and yes, when she saw your name, I briefly told her about you, that Jemima was Patrick's daughter, but she wouldn't believe me and... Hold on. Where did she see my name?" Lydia asked. "I don't understand. She said something about a chart?" Dan shut his eyes. Yes, well, I sort of drew one up for myself, listing the things I was doing as part of my plan. There was a pause, where he imagined Lydia screwing up her face in a frown. "What? And I was on the chart?" She sounded suspicious now. "Yes, but..." He struggled to find the right words. "You know, I talked to you about my sabbatical, how I was sort of picking up the slack, with Patrick not being around for the last 2 months I was off work, and... So I was part of that." Suspicion had given way to indignation, he detected. Injury, even. "Jemima and I, we were just... slack." "No!" God, he wished he wasn't having this conversation out on Putney Embankment, with people shooting him curious looks as they went by. He began walking again, speaking in a lower voice, his head turned away from passers-by. "No, of course not. It was more that I was trying to fill in for my brother, doing things he would have done, and beyond, and... Let me get this straight, because I'm really confused," Lydia said, cutting in. "At the end of next month, or whenever you go back to work, you were going to wash your hands of me and Jemima, and this chart. Time's up, job done." "No, absolutely not." His heart was pounding. "I don't want that. Do you?" There was a terrifying pause when she didn't reply immediately. Unable to bear the silence, Dan ploughed straight on, desperate to explain himself. "I'm sorry," he said again, "about all of this. I'm really, really sorry. Honestly, I put you on the spreadsheet initially because you were sort of a job to deal with at first. A mystery on the bank statement to clear up. But then I met you and got to know you and things changed. I promise. I want to keep seeing you, whatever happens. I want to be part of your life. Jemima's too." She sighed down the phone and his heart clenched at the sound. Was that good or bad? Contemptuous or weary? "Right," Lydia said eventually. "Look, I'd better get back to work. Just thought you should know what had happened. I mean, she was seriously out of control. That was a big, hefty vase as well. If it had hit me... I'm sorry, he said yet again, because it seemed like the only thing he had left to offer. I'll talk to her, he added, even though he was fairly sure Zoe wouldn't want to listen. Then they said goodbye, and he put his phone away, setting off once more in the hope of finding the former rhythm of his run. It was no use, though. His legs felt heavy and his mind was whirling in all directions, trying to imagine the scene in Lydia's shop. Zoe bursting in, shouting at Lydia and throwing a vase at her. It seemed grotesque, impossible. He had never known Zoe act in such a violent or wild manner before. He had done this to her, he thought unhappily, jogging through a puddle and barely noticing as the muddy water splattered up his shins. He was responsible. What was worse was the fact that he had no clue how to put any of this right again. Chapter 30. Sometime later, when Dan arrived home, panting and still not having found any solutions to his problems, he was surprised to see a familiar figure standing at his front door, pressing the buzzer. "Mum?" he said as he approached. She turned round, looking relieved. "There you are. I was starting to think I had the wrong number. Hello there. I won't hug you. You look a bit sweaty for that right now. Everything okay?" He was so taken aback to see her that it took him a moment to fumble his key into the lock. She never usually came to visit. Don't say Zoe had gone steaming and ranting over to his parents' place as well, he thought in dismay. "Yeah, sure," he said. "How are you? Dad's all right, is he?" "He's fine," she replied. "I just thought, well, there I was a few weeks ago, commenting on how rare it was having you come and visit us. And I realised I never come to see you either. So here I am, mending my ways. I brought some rhubarb from the garden, by the way." She brandished a carrier bag, which had pink rhubarb sticks poking out the top. "I thought you could make yourself a crumble. I remembered how much you loved it as a boy. Really tasty with a bit of stem ginger added. That's my tip." "Thanks, Mum." He'd finally got the door open and ushered her inside. "Go on through. I'll have a quick shower, if you don't mind. I'll be 5 minutes." "Good idea," she said. "I'll put this in the fridge for you." A few minutes later, hair still damp and skin pink from the hot water, he emerged to find her out in the garden, examining the dead sycamore. "Oh," he said, stepping outside to join her. "Yeah, I've been meaning to do something about that." "It must have been damaged by the wind originally," she said, running a finger along the rough wood where a branch had broken off. "Fungus would have come in through this wound, look, and killed it. You should get rid of it, Daniel. It's not going to come back to life any time soon." "Yeah, I know," he said, looking down at his feet. "I'll sort it out, Mum." She gazed around the rest of the garden with a practiced eye, bending to pluck some chickweed from the nearest border. "South-facing, isn't it?" she went on, nodding to herself. "Oh, you can make this a lovely spot, you know, if you pull your finger out. These flower beds could be full of colour and wildlife by midsummer. That honeysuckle's healthy enough, and you could plant a couple of roses too. Maybe a nice peony. Fill up the gaps with some annuals. I've got loads of seeds I can give you." Her face was animated. She had always loved planting and growing. Even in their old family home with its tiny backyard, he could remember her watering her pots and window boxes, making use of every inch of space. Indoors too, she had got him and Patrick growing cress and broad beans in pots on the windowsill, with varying degrees of success. She was never happier, she'd once told him, than when her hands were deep in compost. "Come on, we can make a start now," she went on. "Weed these beds ready for planting. Have you got a couple of trowels?" Under his mum's instruction, Dan soon found himself kneeling at the edge of a flower bed, pulling up valerian shoots, red robin and a plant that was apparently called Enchanter's Nightshade. Arriving home, his head had been jangling with Lydia's phone call and alarm over Zoe. But there was something soothing about being outside, having the sun on his shoulders, that took the edge off his stress. A fat pink earthworm squiggled beneath his fingers. A bird trilled from a tree nearby. He hoped Zoe was able to feel similar calm soon, wherever she was now. He hoped she wasn't about to come bursting over the fence in order to throw stuff at him too. "I was thinking about that photograph, by the way," his mum said from the nearby flower bed. "Why you didn't like it. And I found myself remembering that, well, he did go through a bit of an aggressive stage around then, your brother. Got into trouble at primary school a few times for fighting." Dan swivelled his eyes over to her. Did he? He remembered Patrick being something of a golden boy at primary school. Everyone loved him. "Yes, pushing boundaries probably, getting a bit too big for his boots. So I could understand why you might have always thought he was picking on you. In that photograph, I mean." She tossed some large leafy intruder behind her, head still bent over the flower bed. "Right, yes." Blimey, this was a bit of a key change from the wholehearted Patrick adoration that he was used to. "Your dad and I were discussing it last night, how when someone dies, you only ever talk about the good stuff. What a great person they were, so loving and kind and hard-working. That's the temptation, isn't it? To glorify them, make them into saints." She turned then, a rueful smile on her face. "But we all know that's rubbish, don't we? Because nobody's that perfect. Least of all your brother." This was so unexpected, Dan wasn't quite sure what to say. "No," he agreed after a moment. "I mean, we all loved him, of course, that's not in any doubt. But Patrick definitely wasn't a saint. All the lip he gave me as a lad. So unreliable too. Do you remember what a flake he was before he settled down with Zoe? Sometimes whole months would go by and I wouldn't hear from him." She rolled her eyes. "But nobody's perfect, like I said. We're all just muddling along, trying to do our best, getting it wrong sometimes. But that's life." "Yeah," he said, and then feeling the need to confess, he added, "I've got a few things wrong recently." She put her trowel down. "Have you? Like what?" He stared down at the grass. "I was trying to help Zoe out, and so I drew up this sort of plan to organise everything." It sounded so lame now when he said it aloud. "I wanted to be more like Patrick," he blurted out. "I was trying to do the things he would have been around to do. But then Zoe saw the plan and got really angry." "She got angry? When you were trying to help?" This was not the moment to get into the whole Lydia angle. "I went about it a bit clumsily, I guess," he mumbled. "The Patrick plan," Zoe cried scornfully in his head, eyes glittering. "I think I've really upset her." His mum reached out and put a hand on his arm. "Do you know, Daniel, when you came over to see me and your dad the other week and you said that you were standing in for Patrick, well, you don't need to do that, okay? Not for me, not for Zoe. Stick to being your own self because that's good enough. Do you hear me? You don't have to come round and try to be anyone else, or look for jobs you can do, or anything like that. Just be you. That's all I want. As for Zoe, well, it's not my place to say what she wants. I'm sure that would be enough for her too." Her face had become quite stern with this little speech, her chin pointy and determined, as if she was not about to put up with any argument. Dan had a lump in his throat by the end of it. "Thanks, Mum," he said. "Now, are you going to make your old mother a bit of lunch after all this work, or do I have to do everything myself around here?" she demanded. And they were back to normal. "Good idea," he said, getting to his feet. Her words of love were exactly what he needed, he realised, walking towards the kitchen, wondering if he had enough eggs for an omelette. You could waste a lot of time thinking you were second best, the least favourite child, as he had always done. And for what? It had been a pointless exercise in self-pity. Just be you, his mum had told him, and it felt like the warmest of hugs, a proper stamp of approval. He'd reciprocate by making her the best omelette of her life, he vowed, then maybe think about how to put everything else right. Meanwhile, Zoe was having what felt like a breakdown. It had been brewing inside her ever since Dan had dared to say those terrible things in her presence, things she could not, would not believe. And then today, when she finally made the connection between the Lydia of his accusations and the woman she had met in the shop, the anger had burst up out of her like a boiling fountain of rage. You heard about these people and their long cons, leeching on troubled souls and getting fat from their misery and savings. Oh, she'd read the stories in newspapers and online. That was clearly what had happened here, obviously. The conniving bitch in question must have taken one look at the weeping Zoe and rubbed her hands with glee. Some internet digging later, Lydia had latched onto idiot, gullible Dan, who had been only too keen to believe the worst of his brother. Having worked all this out, Zoe had been like a woman possessed. She had driven to Chiswick, parked illegally on double yellow lines. So sue me, she thought, unable to care as she locked the car. And then the sheer power of her fury had sent her shouting, fists clenched, into the shop where she'd first come across that woman, that liar. Zoe wasn't proud of the scene that unfolded, mind. She'd intended to go in, coldly powerful, to look this woman in the eye and make herself clear. I know what you're doing and you don't fool me. It stops right here. But something had gone wrong. A circuit in her brain fusing with the white heat of her anger, perhaps. Because she'd ended up screeching like a banshee and actually throwing, a chunky vase at the bitch's head. She was shaken afterwards, could hardly walk back to the car because her whole body was trembling with the shock of what she'd done. Zoe has a bit of a temper, her secondary school teacher had written in one of her reports. Zoe is too hot-headed and needs to think before she speaks, another had observed. Her mum was fond of recounting stories about Zoe's fiery nature as a little girl. You were just like the girl in the nursery rhyme, she had often said. When she was good, she was very, very good. But when she was bad, she was horrid. Well, she'd been horrid today, all right. She had gone full batshit crazy at another woman in public. Ever since Patrick had died, in fact, her anger had been like a wild horse, unstoppable in its galloping. Driving home from Lydia's shop, heart thumping, adrenaline still pumping on overload, she felt dazed by what she had done, as if it had been an out-of-body experience. The smash of the vase hitting the wall kept ringing in her ears like a warning bell. She could have really hurt the woman, if her aim had been any better. Good, said the anger that still simmered inside her, and it would serve her right. Yeah, but Ethan, Gabe and Bea were relying on her, Zoe reminded herself. Imagine if the woman had been badly hurt and the police had come knocking as a result, charging Zoe with assault, or worse, murder. She might still be reported for damages or a fray. A criminal record could ruin her career, her reputation, her whole life. What had she been thinking? Maybe her boys weren't the only ones who needed some anger management counselling. If she carried on like this, she would self-destruct. Once home, she went inside, feeling sombre and ashamed, hoping she could draw a line under the scene, write it off as a bad day. Wishing she could stop dwelling on how the woman, Lydia, had called after her, her voice clear as a bell. I'm not lying. It's all true. It's all true. It couldn't be true, though, Zoe tried to tell herself, but her hands were shaking as she began gathering together the creased piles of laundry that needed seeing to, focusing hard on the discarded school shirts and pyjamas, as if she needed to study them for a very important test. A sob escaped her throat. Please, don't let this be true. She found herself thinking about the day she'd come back from school, only a bit older than Bea, to find that her dad had left them, gone off with Annabel Clark from the newsagents. How her mum had cried at night for 3 whole weeks, and how they'd all never stopped waiting for him to come home again. In hindsight, that might have been when the anger began, she realised now, stuffing Ethan's dressing gown into the laundry basket with another muffled sob. Then the doorbell rang, and her heart started pounding. It was the police, come to arrest her, she guessed. Or maybe it was Lydia, having tracked her down, an even bigger vase in hand, ready to duke this one out in a proper brawl. Wrenching the door open, ready to defend herself, she saw someone else altogether. Mary, from school. Oh, she said, the adrenaline draining away. She wearily remembered how Mary had asked her for coffee a few weeks ago, and how she had politely refused. Perhaps she hadn't been clear enough at the time. Hi, she added without any enthusiasm. Mary's nose was pink, as if she had a cold, and there was something nervy about the way she kept flicking glances at Zoe, then away again. Is it all right if I come in? She asked. Sorry to bother you. There's just something on my mind. I need to talk to you. Sure, said Zoe, wishing she hadn't opened the door. She wasn't in the mood for any sympathetic how are yous right now. Come in, she added, already feeling defeated. They sat in the living room, Mary having refused offers of a drink. She definitely seemed twitchy, perching on the edge of her chair, shoulders a little hunched, eyes flitting around at everything. So, how are things? Zoe asked, hoping this wouldn't take long. Mary crossed, then uncrossed her legs. Her hands were in her lap, her head angled down in what looked like, well, it actually looked a lot like penitence, Zoe thought, frowning, which was odd. I don't know how to say this, Mary began, raising her gaze. Her face was bone white, bloodless. But I can't keep it to myself any longer. She ground her hands together in her lap as if she was strangling someone, wringing a bird's neck. Remember the other week when I saw you and asked if we could have a chat? It was because she actually looked as if she was going to throw up. You see, the thing is, Zoe, I had an affair with Patrick. Zoe blinked hard, unable to process what she'd just heard. Wait a minute. What? This was not what she'd been expecting. I don't think so, she said faintly. This couldn't be happening, she told herself. She refused to believe it. No, you didn't. And on the day he died, Mary shut her eyes briefly, her mascaraed lashes spidery against her pale cheeks. I found out that I was pregnant. With his baby. No, said Zoe wildly. Unable to keep still, she rose to her feet, full of agitated energy, and paced across the room. Stop it. Did Dan put you up to this? Did Lydia? When you saw me in the doctor's waiting room a few weeks ago, I was there because, again with the strangling hands, Zoe felt like slapping at them. Because I was booking an appointment for an abortion. Tears filmed her eyes and then went trickling down her face. I'm sorry, Zoe. I know you don't want to hear this. Too right I don't. Zoe gulped for breath. There didn't seem to be enough air left in the room. How dare you come into my house and make these despicable allegations? Because it happened, all right? And I loved him too. Her face was wretched and tear-stained, and Zoe had a sudden memory flash of Mary weeping at Patrick's funeral, how over the top it had seemed at the time. I don't believe you, Zoe said, trying to shore up her defences. Her heart was pounding. And if you don't leave my house right now, then I might do something I regret. Go on, get out. I had an abortion. I wish I hadn't, but I did. She gave a sob. I upset Patrick the night he went missing. We had a massive row on the phone, and I've been blaming myself ever since. I'm so sorry. I'm really... No, you're not. You're not sorry at all. Zoe's temper was rising again. She seemed to have no control over herself anymore. Patrick loved me. He wouldn't have... You're talking shit. I'm not. I can prove it. He had a scar on his elbow from where he fell off some rocks as a teenager. Tears streamed down her face. There's a birthmark on his hip, shaped like a heart. His dog, growing up, was called... She floundered. It's on the tip of my tongue. His parents, Derek and Liz, his dog was called... Okay, time's up, you need to go now, Zoe said. The room seemed to be tilting beneath her, as if she'd just stepped off a roller coaster. This proves nothing, other than that you are completely psycho. Get out of my house. Brandy, that was it. Brandy and get out, Zoe said, and then she was screaming. Get out! Get out! Mary scuttled from the room and Zoe flung herself onto the sofa as the front door banged shut, feeling as if she wanted to keep on screaming until she went limp. She clutched at her own head. Why was this happening to her? Zoe had married Patrick because he was loyal, because he was a good person. She could not, would not, accept that she had married a man like her own philandering dad. Patrick was a flirt, sure. He was friendly to men and women. Everyone had loved him. But that didn't mean... She swallowed hard, blood pounding in her ears. Surely that didn't mean... She pulled a cushion over her head, her thoughts whirling. It was true about the scar on his elbow, mind you. And Patrick did have a birthmark on his hip, shaped like a heart. How would Mary have known that? Nausea turned her stomach because now she was imagining the other woman in bed with him, draped across Patrick's naked body, tracing a finger across his skin, outlining that birthmark and commenting on it, just as Zoe had done years earlier when they first started dating. No. It couldn't be true, though. She refused point blank to believe it could be true. I refuse, she said aloud to the cushions. No. She had to refuse. She could not for a second let herself believe that there might be so much as a scrap of truth in this. Because if she began to doubt her own marriage, her own husband, if she allowed such ideas to worm their way into all she had held precious, then... She gasped, dizzied by the awful possibilities currently rippling out around her. Everything she had ever relied upon and trusted felt perilously shaky right now, as if the walls were a mirage, her life flimsy and unreal. Images flashed through her head of Patrick laughing with her female friends, how the school mums used to giggle and bat their eyelashes at him at class assemblies and Christmas concerts, how sometimes he'd disappear for hours on end and she wouldn't be able to get hold of him. He'd always come up with a plausible excuse, though. That was the thing. She'd believed him every time. But was that because the alternative, a life of doubt and suspicion, had been too awful to contemplate? Had trusting him been an act of weakness and denial all along? Groaning, she wrapped her arms around herself, remembering how she'd bumped into Mary in the cemetery a few weeks ago, how it hadn't occurred to her to wonder why the other woman was there at all. She must have gone to pay her respects, just like Zoe. The thought made her feel like puking. She shut her eyes, but Mary's face floated up into her mind. Brandy, that was it. Brandy, the woman cried, shrill with triumph. Zoe didn't half feel like a Brandy herself right now. If it wasn't for the fact that she had to pick up the children from school later and face all the other parents, She would totally be face down in a bottle of brandy, drinking to blot out the horror of today. Instead, she went to her phone. "Claire," she said when she got through to her best friend. Reassurance, that's what she needed. Reassurance from someone who knew. "I need to ask you something, and I want you to tell me the truth." "You sound very serious." "Of course," said Claire. "What is it?" Claire was not a liar. She was the sort of person who would tell you, honestly but kindly, if your bum looked too big in a pair of Lifton-shaped jeans, and if your hairstyle really suited you, or if the hairdresser had just been over-complimenting you for the extra tip. She'd even give you the full hand-on-heart lowdown on whether you'd acted out of line at the school quiz night. And so Zoe was confident Claire would be able to answer this question with her usual directness and make all the bad stuff go away. "Have you," she began, "at any time ever had doubts about me and Patrick? Him being faithful, I mean. Be honest." But instead of the immediate, "No, of course not, babe, what is this?" she had been expecting, there followed a pause that lasted too long. A pause that made Zoe feel as if she'd walked right to the edge of a precipice, only to find it crumbling beneath her feet. Her heart seemed to be lodged in her throat, her stomach on spin dry. "Claire," she whispered, "are you still there?" "I'm here," said Claire, sounding uncharacteristically awkward. Are you at home right now? I'm actually off this afternoon, so I'll come over. Sit tight, all right? I'll be 5 minutes." Zoe put the phone down, her mouth opening in wordless alarm, her spine cold, her heart as weak and fluttery as an injured bird. She had a horrible, prickling premonition that her day was about to get a whole lot worse before it got any better. Chapter 31. Dan's apologetic text to Zoe had been met with a silence that said it all. "I don't forgive you." And so, with a heavy heart, he boxed up the paperwork from Patrick's business, ready to return everything to Q. He had tried but failed. The story of his life right there, he thought. Daniel shows promise but never quite manages to apply himself, as his teachers had said all those years ago. They'd got that right anyway. Putting the box in the car, he headed off, deciding to make a couple of stops en route. First to the Hussain's house, where work was well underway. In the 10 days since the washing machine had caught fire, the pest control team had been round to exterminate all the unwanted bugs. Gleaming new kitchen lino had been laid, the stair carpet had been replaced, and the damp treated. Tamal was at work when Dan rang the bell, but when he introduced himself to Jana, she shook him by the hand, thanking him for everything that had been done, and took him round the house, showing him the improvements. A pistachio cake was cooling on the side in the kitchen, and when Dan commented on how good it smelled, she insisted on wrapping the whole thing in greaseproof paper and packing it in a tin for him. "Please, I want you to have it," she said, ignoring his subsequent protests about how he couldn't possibly, and pressing it into his hands. "Any more problems, it'll be the same phone number, but my sister-in-law Zoe will be taking care of things from now on," he said, the cake tin warm in his arms. He rapped on the lid a little self-consciously. "Thanks again for this. Very kind." "Thank you," she said again, ruffling the hair of a small dark-eyed little girl who was sitting on the floor, methodically pulling plastic pots out of a cupboard. "It's much better here now already. Right, Lila?" It was gratifying and humbling how pleased Dan felt, getting back into his car afterwards. If he'd done nothing else right, at least he had helped this family by making their house a nicer place to live. That must count for something, he told himself. Next stop, Rosemary, looking more cheerful than the last time he had seen her, and enjoying being indignant about the fact that her doctor had suggested she have some help while her wrist was in plaster. Like I'm completely useless, she snorted disparagingly. It was a shame, therefore, that Dan had to spoil the mood by telling her that Zoe would be taking on the property management from now on. Oh no, but I like seeing you and having our chats, she pouted. This was as they sat in the living room together, Desmond kneading her lap with his huge ginger paws, a look of slit-eyed bliss on his fat furry face. Can't you carry on looking after my flat? Let her do the others. Probably not, Dan said. I'm due back at my office job in a month anyway, and this was only ever meant to be a temporary thing. He felt unexpectedly forlorn at the prospect. Well, listen, said Rosemary, digging into an enormous beaded purse. At least let me give you a little something. Here. She pulled out 3 £10 notes and held them towards him. Take that lovely girl out on me. My way of saying thank you for all you've done. Rosemary, no, I couldn't, he said. Was there something particularly hangdog about his face today that was inspiring the tenants to force gifts upon him? He wondered. Honestly, you keep it. No, I insist. You can give her my phone number too if you think she'd like some sewing chat. I wonder why she didn't take up the place on the course. If the London College of Fashion offered her one, she must have been very good, you know. Her mum died the summer she was taking A-levels, Dan said. I don't think her exams were a top priority. Oh, that is a shame. Well, never too late. Tell her to come round and I'll give her some tutoring. I'd like that, actually. I thought she was very nice. She peered at Dan, gimlet-eyed, when he didn't respond immediately. What? Oh, Daniel, don't tell me you've blown this little love affair already. It isn't a love affair, he said. We're just friends, but... Then he sighed, because Rosemary was annoyingly good at leaving a long anticipatory pause that was almost impossible not to fill. I've kind of ruined everything, he muttered. With Lydia, with my sister-in-law, the lot. I should have stayed in my quiet, boring office job rather than attempting anything more challenging. Rosemary made a scoffing noise. Goodness, you are feeling sorry for yourself, she said. Come on then. You might as well share the story while you've still got me to ask for advice. Let's hear it. He sank gratefully into a chair. If someone had told Dan 6 months ago that he would have turned to an 80-something-year-old woman during an emotional crisis of confidence, he would have thought they were on hallucinogenics. But here he was, pouring his heart out with the latest installment of the soap opera that had become his life, ending up with how the Good Deeds plan had hit the buffers in full Technicolor terribleness, and Zoe had gone berserk. She reached over and squeezed his hand. You're a good lad, she said. A very kind person. But mercy me, I do feel sorry for your sister-in-law. Poor woman. This is a dreadful mess, isn't it? Yes, he agreed. I'm on my way over there, actually, to drop off the paperwork and keys to the properties. Jury's still out on whether she'll actually answer the door and speak to me, though. Rosemary frowned. She must be very hurt, she said. But he's the one who's caused that, not you. And she'll know that deep down. Hearing that her husband betrayed her must have been the most awful shock. But she can't even confront him with that now. It's not surprising, really, that she's taken it out on you instead. Dan nodded, mulling it over. So, what do I do? You treat her like a sister, and you keep on being there for her. Apologise for the, excuse me, Daniel, for the rather crass plan you drew up. Be sincere. Keep offering your help. She'll realise that you mean what you say, and she'll come round eventually. Rosemary glanced at the clock on the mantelpiece, then pushed Desmond off her knee. Gosh, where did the time go? That's your fault for yapping on, Daniel. Now I'm going to be late for my art class. Your what? Art class. Is something wrong with your ears as well? She did her best to brush the orange cat hair from her skirt. Desmond, I'm going to have to shave you one of these days if you insist on shedding your beautiful fur everywhere. Right, I'd better go. I didn't realise you went to any classes, Dan said, feeling as if he were being shooed out of the place. I didn't, she replied, picking up a smart maroon handbag with a massive gold buckle. But falling over like that gave me rather a turn. I've become a bit lonely, I think. Cut myself off from the world. I hadn't realised quite how much until I was lying there on the carpet, with nobody to call. Ahem, said Daniel. Apart from your caring landlord, that is. Well, obviously, she beamed at him, herding him towards the door. Apart from you. So I gave myself a bit of a pep talk and decided, bugger it, I'm not past it yet. I need some more pals to see me through the years, hence art class today, and a choir meeting tomorrow. I hear there's a local ladies' sewing club too, called, what is it again? Stitch and Bitch, that's it. Or is it Bitch and Stitch? Anyway, I'm definitely going to join them for some lovely stitching and excellent bitching. She looked delighted with this new attitude, smiling at herself in the hall mirror as she touched up her lipstick. Rosemary, this all sounds brilliant, Dan said. Doesn't it? She replied modestly. Then she patted her hair into shape and picked up her keys. I won't be long, Desmond, she called as she opened the front door. Then she raised a neatly plucked eyebrow at Dan. You should try it yourself. Hobbies, I mean, she said. Maybe that's what's been missing. Following a sleepless night, Zoe had scuttled out on the school run to drop Gabe and Bea first thing, head down and avoiding eye contact. Then came straight home and got back into bed, where she lay scrolling through old video clips of Patrick on her phone until she couldn't take it anymore. She was still there now, numb and shell-shocked, only having moved in order to turn the wedding day photo she kept on the bedside table face down. Her heart felt as if it was breaking all over again, shattering into splinters. Had Patrick ever loved her? She wondered miserably. Had he meant a single word of those vows they'd made? She never would have cheated on him. Never. It hadn't even crossed her mind to look at another man once she met him. She had loved him so, so deeply. But had it all been a game to him? Yesterday had gone from shock to horror before totally hitting the skids. If Zoe had hoped that Claire would make everything better, she soon realised she had been deluding herself. Look, I would have told you at the time if I thought it would have been helpful, but, well, the thing with Mary, I can believe it, I'm afraid, Claire had said, blunt but sorrowful. She'd hardly been able to look Zoe in the eyes since she'd arrived. The two of them were sitting on the sofa together, and she took both of Zoe's hands in hers and held them tight. I'm really sorry. Zoe had stopped breathing, or so it seemed. I can believe it, I'm afraid. What are you saying? She managed to croak. Claire stared down at her star-printed leggings. She had become obsessed with yoga classes recently, but in the annoying, evangelical sort of way that made Zoe feel like tearing open another family bag of chilly sensations and cramming massive handfuls into her mouth. There was that school auction of promises night about a year ago, do you remember? She said after a moment. You had to go home early because one of the kids was poorly or something, but Patrick stayed on. Everyone was really pissed. I went to the loo at one point, and he and Mary, I wouldn't say they were in a clinch as such, but they were standing talking together, and they were very close. Like, she had her back to the wall, and he was practically pressed against her. They sprang apart when I walked up, obviously, but I had a bad feeling about it. Zoe felt herself inflating a little again. That's it. They were just standing next to each other. A bad feeling was nothing. Patrick was a flirty person, big deal. Not quite. Claire's hands, still clasped around Zoe's, were warm and starting to feel sweaty. I saw them another time as well. I was over in Shepherd's Bush, on my way to my brother's house, and I saw Patrick's van parked up. So, he has tenants over there. He was probably... She was sitting in the front seat with him. They each had a takeaway coffee and were sort of snuggled together. Claire swallowed. Then she leaned forward and touched his face. Zoe shut her eyes. Face-touching was pretty intimate, she had to concede. In the early days of their relationship, whole evenings had passed where the two of them had lain in bed, touching each other like that. Tiny personal strokes delighting in the other's skin, learning the respective language of each other's faces, bodies, hair. I mean, I didn't say anything to you because she might have been brushing a bit of pastry off his cheek or an eyelash. Claire was sounding defensive now, as if she half expected Zoe to launch into a full "why the hell didn't you tell me" accusation. It wasn't as if they were kissing passionately or boffing away on the dashboard, but no words seemed to be available to Zoe. She felt as if her whole life, her lovely, perfect life, was pixelating before her eyes. Pixelating and breaking up, disintegrating. The man she had loved was not the person she'd always thought. The man she had loved had pressed himself against Mary O'Connor, cozied up in the cab of his van with her, allowed her to trace the outline of his heart-shaped birthmark. Worse, he had got her pregnant. So did that mean that Lydia... Oh God. Now Zoe was shaking all over. She thought about the many times she'd searched for a sign from Patrick after his death. Some kind of message. Well, here it was. A Molotov cocktail chucked through the window, blowing up before her eyes. So if Mary had been telling the truth, then maybe Lydia had too, she thought dazedly. And if Lydia was telling the truth, then there was another child of Patrick's out there, a half-sibling to Ethan, Gabe, and Bea. I'm going to... She gulped, wrestling herself free from Claire's grasp and running out to the loo, where she threw up again and again. No, she thought desperately. No, please, no. She didn't want this to be happening. I can't bear it, she sobbed, as Claire came in to find her kneeling on the bathroom floor. I just can't bear it if this is true. But Claire's kind hand on her back and sympathetic silence only told her that she was going to have to bear it, like it or not. The doorbell rang downstairs now, and Zoe groaned in frustration. For crying out loud. She was having a private nervous breakdown up here. Why couldn't everyone leave her alone? She was tempted to ignore the caller, in case it was Mary again, or worse, some other woman that Patrick had wronged her with, but forced herself out of bed and down the stairs with supreme effort. If it was a delivery person with a present for Gabe's upcoming birthday, she'd only end up having to trek out and pick it up from the sorting office, which would be extremely irritating, she figured. Dan was on the doorstep carrying a box of stuff. The same box of stuff connected to Patrick's business that she'd given him a month earlier by the look of things. A great weariness enveloped Zoe. She felt very much like ramming the entire box into the dustbin. "Hi," said Dan. He looked nervous but determined. Right, so here it all is. Let me know if there's anything you're not clear about or if I can do anything else. I know I messed up, Zoe. I know you're mad at me. But I hope that one day we can... He paused. Are you all right? No. She gulped. She was so relieved to see his kind face that her anger with him dissolved. The painted kitchen and his stupid chart no longer seeming important. Her chin wobbled with the effort of trying not to burst into tears again. "I'm sorry, Dan. About everything, She took the box from him because she didn't know what else to say. Her hands were shaking. A tear plopped from her eyes onto the folders and laptop inside. "Oh, God, sorry." "It's okay," he said. His hands twitched by his sides as if he was wondering whether or not he should try to give her a hug. He must have been too scared after their last encounter, though, because he just shuffled his feet around awkwardly and asked, "Do you want to chat, or—" Did she want to chat? Not really. Zoe wanted to dig a big hole and make all of this go away forever. Stick her fingers in her ears so that she couldn't hear any more accusations or gossip. Maybe leave the country for good measure, start over somewhere else, where nobody knew her. "I don't know," she mumbled, putting the box down on the floor and scrubbing her eyes with her sleeve. "Have you eaten anything?" he asked after a moment. "Why don't I take you for lunch somewhere?" He was peering at her with concern. "How about the Greyhound? Haven't been there for ages. Fancy it?" She drew breath, realising that she was starving, remembering that she had once had the best chicken pie of her life at the Greyhound, and that it might be exactly what she needed right now. They could always go and sit in the garden if she felt like crying again, she supposed. "Yes, please," she said, in a tiny voice. At least something seemed to be going her way today, because, hallelujah, the chicken pie was still on the menu at the Greyhound, and it tasted every bit as delicious as she remembered. With each forkful of pastry and gravy and mash, Zoe felt her equilibrium gradually start to return, little by little, crumb by crumb. Dan kept the conversation going by talking through the tenants he'd been dealing with, listing various problems that had arisen and solutions he had found. But it was very much filler chat, when they both knew there were far more serious subjects lurking unspoken. What the hell, she thought after a while, fortified by food. It was time to address the big old elephant in the room. "So," she said, when he paused for breath, "maybe we should talk about other things, like what you were saying the other day, about this Lydia woman." Dan blanched, but then a moment later he nodded and met her gaze across the table, his eyes anxious but kind. "Okay. God, this was hard. I didn't want to believe you," Zoe stammered. "But something else has happened since then. Someone else, I should say, and now—" She put her knife and fork down, pleating her fingers together in her lap. "Now I'm not so sure." Halfway through a chip, he stiffened at her words, not looking at her as he chewed and swallowed. "I know it's horrendous, but I'm pretty certain Lydia's not lying," he said, eventually. "Her daughter is the spit of Patrick, for one thing." Tears brimmed in Zoe's eyes again, and she dabbed at them with the napkin. "Do you think he actually loved me, Dan?" she asked, her lip trembling. "At all?" His expression was gratifyingly shocked, at least. "Of course. Oh my God, yes. Yes, Zoe. So much. He adored you." He could hardly say it enough times. "I promise you, he was mad about you. 100%. Then why?" She picked up her fork again and swooshed it glumly through the mashed potato. "Why would he cheat on me? If he loved me so much?"
This is the end of CD9. The book continues on CD10.